Hi, welcome back guys. This is your friend, the Broccoli Fanfics. Back with amazing fanfiction. This is the series of What If Deku Had Sentient Mimic Quirk? Now before starting, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you want more videos like this. Now let's get into the fanfic. Izuku stared at the door to the library, reaching his hand out to open the doorknob. He was sure that this library wasn't supposed to exist. It was nowhere on any maps of this area, and looking up its name, Quirky Books, gave no results. So yeah, he seriously doubted that it was actually supposed to exist. And of course, he wanted to know about the library that probably wasn't supposed to exist. So, he twisted the doorknob and walked inside, closing the door behind him. Everyone looked up and stared at him, most in either fear or surprise. Most of them were strangely mutated in some way, although it wasn't actually that strange, what with quirks and all that. Behind the desk stood a woman, most likely the librarian. She looked to be in her early 20s. She had short, chin-length hair, which was dark brown, almost black in color. Her eyes were a beautiful golden color, framed by red glasses. She wore a traditional, red kimono, with a light yellow obi. She smiled gently at him, and walked out from behind her desk, over to a table. "Come here, I have a story to tell you. It started over 200 years ago, at the dawn of quirks," the librarian began. As Izuku took a seat at the table, there were few at the time. Some feared them, while others admired them. At the time, most who had quirks were driven mad with power, throwing the world into chaos. I should know I was there. However, there was a group of vigilantes, called the Peacekeepers. They were, in a way, the world's first heroes. They brought light in a time of darkness, and were led by the first. The first was the younger of two brothers, who had sibling quirks to match. One good, one evil. The first had a stockpiling quirk known as One for All, a quirk that could be passed down from generation to generation. His older brother had a quirk called All for One, which let him steal quirks, and give them to others if he so desired. The eldest brother wanted to rule the world, and he wished for his brother to join him. However, the first wanted nothing more than to protect innocent lives from people like his brother. The two brothers became opposing forces, and ever since, One for All has been passed down among heroes, in hopes of defeating the first brother, who calls himself All for One after his quirk. The thing most people didn't know was that both of them were sentient quirks. They hid this fact from almost everyone, but I managed to find out. I befriended One for All, although I have long since lost sight of her. She's been covering her tracks quite well, recently. I don't know who her current host is. The librarian went silent, and Izuku took this as his cue to speak. "Why are you telling me all this?" "Well, this library is able to be accessed by sentient quirks and myself. A regular human shouldn't be able to come here. Not to mention, you look exactly like how Mimic did." The librarian responded. "Who's Mimic?" Izuku asked, tilting his head ever so slightly. The librarian didn't speak for a moment, as if reminiscing. "Mimic. He was All for One and One for All's younger brother. He was a copy quirk, and he never had a host. I had offered to be his host, but he refused. He wanted to share hosts with one of his siblings, but he didn't want to choose sides. We were friends, him and I. We built this library together, for quirks like him, who didn't have hosts. He only existed for 10 years, since a quirk survival is dependent on having a host. I can't be sure, but I think that you might be his reincarnation." Izuku stared at the librarian owlishly, mouth opening, before closing once again. He didn't know what to say to that, honestly. The reincarnation of a sentient copy quirk? But I'm quirkless, was all Izuku could come up with. She smiled at him. Well, quirks don't typically possess other quirks. Izuku wasn't sure what he had expected when he entered the library, but this was not it. He came back. Of course he came back. He still had questions after his last visit, and not to mention, after the librarian had revealed that he might be the reincarnation of her old friend, he sort of felt obliged to go back. He let out a long exhale before opening the door, walking inside. The people inside didn't seem as scared of him this time, although some seemed surprised that he had returned. They were all quirks, he now realized. All of them except him, and from what he could tell, the librarian. It explained why they were so surprised to see him entering the first time. He was a human and wasn't supposed to be there. Except, was he actually even human? After what he'd been told last time he was here, he couldn't be too sure. The librarian smiled at him from behind her desk. "You've come back, I see." Izuku nodded. "Why? I have a lot of questions." "Oh, my name is Midoriya Izuku, by the way. And I might have answers." "Sick," she responded, gesturing for him to come closer. He approached the desk slowly, coming to a stop a meter away. "So, last time I was here, you said that you were there at the dawn of quirks? But that doesn't make sense because no one could live that long normally, so, do you have an immortality quirk or something?" Izuku asked. Chiesa nodded. "Yes, it's called Fountain of Youth. Ever since I turned 20, it's been preventing me from aging." "Does that mean you can't be killed? Do you get sick, or does your quirk prevent it? Are you able to regenerate when you get injured?" "What would dash?" Izuku began rambling, only to cut himself off. "Sorry, I get excited when it comes to quirks." Her smile turned sad-looking. "Don't apologize, it's fine. As for your questions, my quirk only prevents me from aging. I can still get sick or be killed." "You look sad. Is that something that he?" Izuku asked, trailing off at the end. "Something that Mimic used to do?" "Yeah, it was." Chiesa finished for him. The library went silent after that, and Chiesa left to use the bathroom. Izuku walked over to one of the empty tables, sitting down at it and resting his head in his hands. This was all so very weird. At first, he wasn't sure if he wanted to believe it, that he might be the reincarnation of a sentient quirk, but at this point he had to at least consider it. Mimic had the same mumbling habit he did, apparently. Not to mention that according to Chiesa, they looked the same. He wasn't even supposed to be able to see this place, either, let alone enter, but if he were the reincarnation of someone who'd helped build it. Plus, if he had a quirk, a copy quirk, would be the perfect fit for him, with how much he analyzes them. But the idea of it was strange. All his life, he'd be the quirkless Deku, and now he was finding out that he might be the reincarnation of a quirk? It was just so surreal. He came back. He kept coming back. At first, it was curiosity, but after the 5th visit, it was more because of familiarity. Only 5 visits, and it felt as if he'd been going there his whole life. The more he went, the more he felt like maybe he really was Mimic's reincarnation. Sometimes, he'd spend the time talking to Chiesa, getting to know her better. He sort of felt like he already knew some things before she told him, like how she had a hobby of writing, despite never publishing anything. Sometimes, he simply studied for tests or worked on his homework. Sometimes he'd find a book that interested him, and would sit and read it until he had to go home. He didn't really talk to any of the quirks there, not yet at least. He didn't know how to go about approaching them, and none of them came over to him, so he still didn't know any of them. Although, he got a feeling that Chiesa would introduce him to some of them soon, if he didn't introduce himself. Well, he'd just have to see what the next chapter of his life held for him, tomorrow. Right now, it was 3 a.m., and he needed to sleep. Everyone looked up as the door slowly opened, and Izuku stumbled into the library, tears in his eyes. Chiesa rushed over to him. "Midoriya-san? What's wrong?" It's nothing, I just had a really bad D-Day." Izuku stuttered, wiping the tears with his sleeve. He walked over to one of the tables, sitting down as Chiesa followed him over. She sat down across from him. "Would you like to talk about it?" He stared at the table, as if thinking for a moment before speaking. "A lot happened. Cake Hacken destroyed one of my notebooks. I worked so hard on it and he said I'd take one dive off our roof. And then slime monster T tried to suffocate me, but all might saved me. Then I asked if I could be a true quirkless hero." Izuku paused, uselessly wiping away some of his tears. He said no. Chiesa was silent for a moment, wanting to make sure Izuku had finished speaking before she said anything. "Well, if it's of any consolation to you, I think you'd make a great hero, whether you have a quirk or not." "Thanks, Chiesa-sama." Izuku sniffed, although he tried his best to give a smile. Chiesa opened her arms up in an offer to give him a hug, and after a moment, he crashed into her arms, tears in his eyes. He stayed at the library until his mom texted him, asking where he was. It was only later that day that he found out Bakugo had been attacked by that same sludge villain, and ended up being sent to the hospital. Izuku sat in the car, next to his mother, staring out the window as she drove them to the hospital. Earlier that morning, Izuku had accidentally let it slip that he'd been attacked by the sludge villain, and so she was bringing him to the hospital to treat any damage the attack might have caused. She had already planned on going. She wanted to check in on the Bakugas. Mitsuki and Masaru had stayed there overnight, refusing to leave Katsuki's side, but now that she had learned of Izuku's potential injury, that just made the visit all the more urgent. "Honey, you should have told me as soon as it happened," Inko said, and Izuku nodded absent-mindedly. He knew that she was just worried about his well-being, but he really wished she would just listen when he said he was fine. He was really. Other than burns and bruises from the bullying, he didn't have any injuries. Not to mention, those burns and bruises were the entire reason why he didn't want to go to the hospital. They would find his injuries, and then he'd have to tell them about the bullying, which he didn't want to do. After all, if people found out about the bullying, Bakugo would get in trouble, and then he wouldn't be able to become a hero. He didn't want to do that to Bakugo. But he hadn't been able to convince his mom not to take him to the hospital, so here he was, trying to figure out how to prevent Bakugo from getting in trouble because of it. The car stopped at the hospital before he could come up with something, though, and he climbed out of the car, along with Inko. They went inside, and brought Izuku to a room as soon as Inko told them what had happened. Inko left to check in on the Bakugas once the doctors had started checking up on him. As he had already known, he didn't have any injuries other than bruises and burns, which had been easily treated leading to now. "From what your mother told us, you shouldn't have all these burns. Can you please tell me what actually happened?" asked the doctor, a clipboard in her hands. And, well, Izuku couldn't come up with a good lie. So, he had to tell the truth. He stared at his lap as he said, "Well, one of my classmates, he has an explosion quirk, and hel likes to use it on me." She nodded and asked, "Could you tell me his name?" Izuku knew why she asked that. If he answered, then Bakugo would get in trouble. But he wasn't going to lie to her, and it's not like he could just, well, not answer. So, once again he told the truth, Bakugo K. Katsuki. She nodded once again, seemingly writing something on the clipboard. "Thank you. Would you be all right if I left you here for a moment?" Once he had nodded, she left, guilt seeping into his mind. He'd just ruined Bakugo's dreams, all because he couldn't keep his mouth shut and ended up in a hospital. He was worse than useless, he was just in the way of everyone else. Maybe he should just take Bakugo's advice. No, he couldn't just do that. What about Mom and they'd be sad if he did that. He didn't want to make them sad. If he really was Mimic, he'd already left Chiesa once. He couldn't do that to her a second time. He sighed, leaning against the wall as his own mind taunted him. Hopefully, Yue would realize that Bakugo was meant to be a hero, and wouldn't ban him for something so silly. He came back to the library. He always did. It was one of the few places where he was accepted despite his quirklessness. Funny how a group of sentient quirks were more accepting of him than his own classmates. Although, he still hadn't really talked to any of them. Maybe it was about time to turn the page and change that. So, he mustered up the courage to talk to one of the nearest quirks. They were standing at a bookshelf, seemingly searching for something. They seemed almost dragon-like, with their wings, scales, claws, tail, and general face shape. Izuku walked over to where they stood, and they turned to face him. "Whatcha doing?" Izuku asked, not having any other idea what to say. Before he could get nervous that he'd said the wrong thing, they shrugged. "Oh, I'm just looking for a new book to read. Got any recommendations?" In a moment, Izuku went into a ramble about all of his favorite books, most being from the pre-Quirk era such as Wonder or The Hunger Games. That night, he learned that they were named Dragonlash, and felt that he had made a new friend. Maybe, just maybe coming to this library all those weeks ago had started a new, better chapter in his life. Bakugo clutched the unopened letter in his hands, confused. The letter was from UA, but it was still 10 months before the entrance exam, so why would they be sending him mail? It didn't make any FING sense. But it's not like he could just ignore a letter from UA, so he tore the envelope open and unfolded the paper. Both his parents stood beside the hospital bed he sat on, waiting for his reaction. His brows furrowed as he read, and by the time he finished, he was so sad that he might blow up the letter. They FING rejected me. Bakugo growled, and Mitsuki snatched it out of his hands to see for herself. Her eyes widened as she read, and when she finished she handed the paper to Masaru, turning to look at Bakugo. He had never seen such a bewildered expression on her face as she said, "Katsuki Bakugo, you were banned from UA for bullying Izuku? Care to explain?" Izuku sat in the car next to his mother once more, as she drove them to the hospital. They were only going to visit Bakugo this time. Apparently, he'd be leaving the hospital in a week if everything went well. He'd be fine, but Izuku wanted to see for himself. After all, if he hadn't grabbed onto All Might's leg, maybe the sludge villain wouldn't have gotten free. "Honey, you don't have to visit him, you know. The doctors told me about what he's been doing to you," Inko said, and Izuku shook his head, "No, I want to go." He needed to make sure his stupid mistake didn't end up hurting Bakugo. Inko sighed, but she nodded nonetheless. There was no point in arguing with him over it, really. They got out of the car once they were there, walking through the hospital in order to find the Bakugis. Inko led the way, since she had already visited earlier. They stopped at one of the doors, and not too long after Inko had knocked, Mitsuki opened the door. "Oh, Inko-chan, Izu-chan. Come on in," she said, smiling. They went inside, to see Bakugo sitting on the hospital bed, a scowl on his face. Other than his angry expression, he looked like he was fine, and he always looked angry. But then Bakugo turned to face them. In an instant, his usual annoyed sort of anger went up to uncontrolled rage, and he was jumping out of the bed, explosions in his palms. "DKU. You ruined everything for me," he growled, moving to attack Izuku. Mitsuki and Masaru each grabbed one of Bakugo's arms, holding him back, and Izuku dived behind Inko in an attempt to hide himself. It didn't work very well, since he was taller than her. "We should probably leave," Inko said, ushering Izuku out of the room. Izuku complied easily, still shaken up by Bakugo's outburst. He should have expected it. Honestly, of course Bakugo would get mad at him and try to attack. His breathing started to speed up, and Inko placed her hands on his shoulder. Hey, it's okay, sweetie, you're gonna be okay. Just copy my breathing, okay?" She seemed anxious as she spoke, as if she wasn't entirely sure on how to handle the situation. He nodded nonetheless, slowing his breathing down to match hers. Copying was easy, he could do that. Once he had calmed down, she sent him back to the car, while she talked to Mitsuki. That meeting definitely could have went better, but at least now he knew that Bakugo was relatively okay. Izuku had a very strange dream that night. He couldn't remember the exact details, but he knew that Chiesa was in the dream, and there was an older girl who he'd been calling Eni-chan. He also remembered that he and Chiesa had been sitting in a shopping cart, while the other girl pushed it all around the store. The dream felt familiar, though, and he briefly wondered if it might have been a memory from when he was Mimic. He groaned as he rolled out of bed. He didn't entirely want to wake up. He wanted to go back to the dream. It felt so right, and while being pushed around in a shopping cart had been kind of terrifying, but, well, he wanted to have that kind of friendship. But he had to get up, whether he wanted to or not. He got dressed, and after eating breakfast, he left the apartment, red shoes clacking on the sidewalk with each step. He didn't know why he was going to the library this time, but that was where he was going. Of course, it wasn't that strange that he was going to the library. That was where he spent most of his time anymore. No one really reacted to him entering anymore. They were used to him being here. He waved to Dragonlash as he walked past them, sending a glance to the empty desk that Chiesa would normally be standing behind. Izuku felt strangely drawn to a forgotten bookshelf in the back, one that he hadn't even realized was there. Curious as to what was causing it, he approached it, coming close enough to inspect the bookshelf. It didn't look all that special. It seemed pretty old, if anything, with all the dust on it. Actually, that bit of the shelf looked like he could move it. He put his hand on it, and pushed it downwards, causing for a doorway to open up. Did he just find a secret passageway? Yeah, he definitely just found a secret passageway. He looked around behind him and saw that no one was looking, so he went inside. The door slid shut behind him. The tunnel was made of stone bricks and shaped like an arch. It was lit by many torches, giving the area a sort of eerie glow. Izuku stood there in awe for a moment, taking in the scene before he continued on. The tunnel wasn't very long and led to a medium-sized room that looked oddly like someone's bedroom. Actually, it looked like a bedroom he might have had if he wasn't so much of a hero fanboy. There was only one picture in the room, sitting on the desk. In it were 3 people, that was Mimic, Chis, and a girl with short, golden hair and shining blue eyes. That was the girl from his dream. In the picture, Mimic was giving Chiesa bunny ears, while Chiesa held up the phone, and the other girl had her elbows perched on both of them. They were standing in front of the library, although it looked a lot newer. Looking at the picture, he realized that he really did look like Mimic. The only difference was that Mimic's wide, toothy grin looked far more genuine than any smile Izuku had given in a while. Before he realized it, he was clutching the picture close to his chest, tears rolling down his cheeks as he stumbled over to the bed, sitting down on it. A strange, bittersweet feeling bubbled up in his chest, almost like nostalgia, except that couldn't be right. He'd never been here before. This was probably Mimic's bedroom, huh? His old bedroom. At this point, there wasn't any question in the matter. There was no way he wasn't Mimic's reincarnation. Not with, almost everything that had happened since he first came to this library. So then the other girl must be one for all, he mumbled to himself. The name didn't feel right on his tongue, though. Nichan. All it took was saying that nickname, and he burst into tears once more. Chiesa walked back into the main part of the library, having just went to the bathroom. She looked out at the quiet scene, sighing to herself. Midoriya normally would have come by now. There was a chance that something had come up, of course, but still, she had a sinking feeling that something was happening to him right now, and she couldn't help but feel concerned. She walked up to Dragon Lash. Hey, have you seen Midoriya-san at all today? Dragon Lash looked up from the book they were reading. Yeah, last I saw him, he was heading to the back. Dunno why, though. Chiesa nodded, and Dragon Lash went back to their book, while Chiesa headed over to the back. What would Midoriya be doing back there? Unless he somehow figured out about Mimic's old room. She rushed over to the old bookshelf, and sure enough, the secret lever on the shelf had been moved recently, if the lack of dust there said anything. She pressed down on it, opening the secret passageway and heading inside. As she walked through the tunnels, the sound of crying became louder and more clear, causing her to pick up her pace. Had he been hurt by something? As she got closer, though, she heard him mumble out the word, Nichan. That's probably why he's crying. She walked into the bedroom, to see Midoriya sitting on the bed, clutching a picture frame to his chest. More specifically, the picture they'd taken when they finished building the library. Hey, she said, voice barely more than a whisper. Midoriya heard her, though, as he looked up at her, wiping tears from his eyes. Kiyasa-sama. I'm sorry, Kiyasa-sama. I'm not sure why you're apologizing, but don't. You have nothing to apologize for. Chiesa responded, a gentle smile on her face. Midoriya hesitated, before shaking his head. No, I should have taken your offer. I shouldn't have just left you like that. Aside, moving to sit down on the bed next to him. You were a kid and you still are. Don't beat yourself up over it. He didn't respond, so Chiesa couldn't be sure if he'd actually listen, but he leaned onto her side, head resting on her shoulder. He was still holding the photo close to his chest, as if it would disappear if he let go of it. So you really are him, huh? She asked, although it was more of a statement than a question. He nodded nonetheless, still sniffling a bit. She hesitated a moment before asking, do you remember anything? From when you were Mimic, I mean. Kind of? I don't really remember anything, but this room feels familiar to me, I guess? And I recognize, Nichan. And I also had a dream last night, which I think was actually one of my memories from when I was Mimic. They continued to sit there in silence, Midoriya taking comfort in Kiasa's presence. It wasn't how either of them had expected the day to go, but maybe that wasn't necessarily a bad thing. Bakugo groaned as he wrote out the application. He didn't want to be applying to any school other than UA, but with the stunt FING Deku pulled, he was forced to pick a different one. Luckily, he hadn't been banned from all hero schools, just UA. Meaning, he was currently filling out an application for Shiketsu's entrance exam. It wasn't UA, but he'd be demed if he didn't end up being the best hero out there, whether he went to UA or not. He'd make UA regret banning him, just you wait. For the first time in a while, Izuku found himself hesitating at the library's door. After what had happened yesterday, he wasn't too sure if he really wanted to go in. Well, no, that's not it. He wanted to go in, why wouldn't he? It was probably his favorite place in Matsudafu at this point. But, well, would Chiesa treat him differently, now that they knew for sure that he was Mimic's reincarnation? Sure, he knew that he was almost the exact same as he'd been in his past life, according to what Chiesa told him, but, well, he couldn't really help but be nervous. He supposed 10 years of bullying would do that to you. He sighed, reaching out his hand to grab the knob. Even if he was nervous, he couldn't just disappear on Chiesa again. He let out a sad laugh at the thought. Wasn't that why he had kept coming back, before the place grew on him? He hadn't wanted to put Chiesa through that a second time. He twisted the knob before he got caught up in his thoughts, opening the door up. The sight that greeted him was a familiar one for him. The others were all either reading something, looking at the bookshelves, or chatting with one another. Chiesa was behind her desk, doing whatever it was she did when she was at her desk. She waved at him, giving a gentle smile like how she normally did, and all the tension left Izuku's body. Things hadn't changed just because they confirmed it. Why would they? After all, they had already suspected it. This was really just a confirmation. Izuku continued to return to the library. It was a relatively normal Friday. Bakugo had been released from the hospital, so he was a bit stressed from trying to avoid a beating, but surprisingly enough, none came. Was it because he'd been banned from UA? Either way, he was a bit stressed from school, but it was overall a normal Friday. Up until he got to the library, that is. Not entirely true. Things were still normal at the library. It was only while talking to Dragonlash that things became, well, not normal. He wasn't exactly sure when it had happened, but at some point, he must have activated his old abilities on accident, because when he went to grab a notebook out of his backpack, he saw that his fingers had changed to look like Dragonlash's claws. Safe to say, he screamed for a good few seconds before he realized what had actually happened. Izuku sat in his bedroom, the one in Inko's apartment, not the one in the library, explosions popping in his hands. It was the middle of the night, and he really should have been sleeping, but he had developed his abilities, and he was just so excited to try them out. Okay, so maybe he shouldn't be mimicking Bakugo's quirk so soon, with all the bullying and whatnot, but Explosion was just so cool, almost as cool as Bakugo. It was like he had started a whole new arc in his life. He could copy quirks now. It was so cool. Although, he probably should switch to a different quirk. While Explosion was a cool quirk, almost every blast had him flinching. What was a different quirk he could try to copy? Oh, maybe he could try a mutation quirk. What mutation quirks did he know? Hawk's quirk was a mutation quirk. And it was a really useful one at that. He tried to picture himself with Hawk's wings, the same thing he'd done with Bakugo's quirk. When he opened his eyes again, he saw huge, red wings bursting out of his back. His lip quivered with excitement as he tried to suppress an excited squeal. This was so cool. Excitedly, he attempted to make one of the feathers come off, and sure enough, it did. He telepathically made it fly around his room a few times, and couldn't suppress his excitement any longer as he cheered, "Woo! Izuku, honey, it's midnight, you should be in bed." One for All walked along behind Yagi, invisible to everyone but herself. It was the way it had been for years. Ever since she fell out of contact with Chiesa, no one had known about her. Well, no one had known that she was a sentient quirk, at least. There were a few people who knew that she existed, just not of her sentience. She felt strange. She had, ever since Yagi had encountered that quirkless boy with curly green hair and wide eyes. He looked so much like her little brother, Mimic. But that couldn't possibly be right, because Mimic was long gone by now. He had died because he didn't have a host 200 years ago. Still, though, the similarity was uncanny. It made her miss her brother even more than she had in the past 2 centuries, and what Yagi had said to the boy didn't help any. She sighed to herself. Maybe she should visit the library later, talk to Chasa. It would be good to catch up with her old friend. Izuku let the red wings spread out behind him, while some of the other quirks rolled their eyes, chuckling at how excited he seemed. He couldn't help it. After discovering his abilities yesterday, he was just so excited to try them out, but his mom had made him go to sleep before he could really do that much with it. Which was why he was doing it in the library. Plus, he wasn't sure how to tell his mom about it just yet. After all, what was he supposed to say? That he was the reincarnation of a sentient copy quirk? That probably wouldn't end very well. Oh, how come when you copy me you freak out, but then when you copy Hawks then you're all excited? Dragonlash whined, although they laughed soon after, showing that they were only joking about it. I was just surprised is all. Izuku replied, playfully nudging them. They chuckled. Well, why don't you copy someone other than Hawks? I mean, you copied him last night, didn't you? He hummed before nodding. Yeah, I guess I did. The feathers disappeared in an instant, and he put his hand to his chin as he thought about it for a moment, before snapping his fingers. I know. I could try to copy Edgeshot's quirk. After a moment of thinking about it, his arm flattened from the elbow down. Dragonlash chuckled. That'll probably be a hard one to control, even with how much you like to analyze quirks. Izuku nodded. Yeah, probably. Shirudo Maki looked over the application for the 3rd time since she received it. It was from a boy named Katsuki Bakugu, from Aldra Junior High. He had previously applied to UA, but was rejected because of a history of bullying. She had thought of doing the same at first. But now she wasn't too sure. Perhaps if he were to pass the entrance exam, she could help him grow to be a better person, at least, if he was willing to change. After all, that would be one less bully in the world, and that would be a good thing, would it not? She nodded to herself and set down the application. She'd let him attend the entrance exam, and if he passed, then as long as he was willing to become a better person, he could attend at Shiketsu High. Izuku sat on the couch, waiting anxiously for Inko to say what she had called him over for. Was he in trouble? Did she somehow find out about the library? Did she know that he could? Honey, I think it might be a good idea for you to switch to online school. Inko said, breaking him out of his thoughts. You don't have to if you don't want to, but I don't really think you should stay at Aldera, and other schools probably won't be much better about preventing discrimination. But wouldn't that be too expensive for you? Izuku asked. Inko shook her head. You don't need to worry about that, sweetie. I found some affordable programs that might work well for you, if you want to look. I'll think about it. Izuku came back to the library the next day, a dilemma on his hands. He didn't know what he was supposed to do after his mom had talked to him about online schooling. He didn't want to burden his mom like that, but at the same time, there would be so many positives of online schooling. He'd have more free time to practice his abilities, he wouldn't have to worry about Bakugu, he could spend more time at the library. Still though, he couldn't bring himself to burden Inko for his own benefits. While she had said it wouldn't be a problem for her, Izuku knew that she tried to hide the stress he always brought her. She wasn't very good at hiding it, but he never bothered to tell her that. After all, if she knew that he knew, it would only stress her out even more, and he hated to see her so stressed because of him. But even though he knew that it would only make him more of a burden than he already was, there was that selfish part of him that so badly wanted to accept the offer. Which was exactly why he was coming to the library. He needed to talk to Chiesa, and she would talk him out of being selfish like that, and then it wouldn't be a problem anymore. And if she said that he should go, well, Chiesa was smarter than he was, so if Chiesa said he should take online schooling, then he supposed that he would. But it was unlikely that she'd say he should. He walked up to the counter, and Chiesa looked up from what she was doing. He still didn't know what it was, and said, "Hello, Midoriya-kun. How'd school go?" He shrugged in response. It was the same as usual, but I need your help with something. Oh, did something happen? she asked, and he nodded slowly. Yeah. Last night, my mom said that I should maybe try doing online schooling. She already had some programs in mind and everything. Izuku started and she gave him a confused look. That sounds like a good thing. It is. Except, I don't want to be a burden to her, but I do want to try online school, so I don't really know what to do. Izuku sighed, and Jisa shook her head as if it was a silly question. Midoriya-kun, you aren't being a burden to her, you know. You're her kid, it's her job to take care of you. If she thinks that you'd be better off in online school, and you want to try it, then you should. Thanks, Kiyasa-chan. Izuku walked out of the library, earning himself a few stares since he had appeared out of seemingly nowhere. After all, no one else could see the library. He was more than used to the strange looks by now, having been visiting the library for so long. It didn't take long for people to chalk it up to some sort of invisibility quirk, though, and they moved on with their day and he moved on with his. His shoes thudded along on the sidewalk, their bulky soles making them heavier and thus a bit louder than others. While it wasn't near dark yet, and he certainly could stay out later, he wanted to head home now, so that he could tell his mom what his decision was. Plus, he heard that Gang Orca had been in a villain fight recently, and he was dying to analyze it. As he walked, he passed by a park, titled Sakura Plaza, if he remembered correctly. He had passed it several times before, although he never actually went in. It was a nice place from what he could tell, though with lots of trees, flowers, and some playground equipment. He just never really had an interest in going there. As he passed it, however, he noticed that there was a strange figure in one of the trees. Curious, he approached it, only to realize that the figure was a short boy around his age, with a bird head and dark clothing. Is he stuck up there? Dude, you need help getting down from there? Izuku asked, and the bird-headed boy laughed like he had made a joke. Nonsense. I am not in need of saving, for I have become one with my brethren, he said, and Izuku nodded as if he understood what that meant. He looked around awkwardly, unsure of what to do. Although, now that he thought about it, that tree did look kind of comfy. Would you mind if I joined you then? He asked, and the bird-headed boy nodded. I don't see a reason to prevent it. Izuku grinned at him, and began climbing up without much struggle. Despite not being very strong physically, he was good at climbing trees since he often did it to hide from bullies. Once he had gotten onto the branch, he sat down next to Tokoyami. Oh, I'm Midoriya Izuku, by the way. Tokoyami Fumikage. The boy responded, and he nodded. They sat in the tree together, mostly in peaceful silence, although they did converse some. That was when a dark, shadowy figure came out of Tokoyami's back. They were shaped almost like a bird, and had glowing yellow eyes. It was relatively easy for Izuku to recognize the figure as a sentient quirk, having spent most of his time around them, and, well, being one himself, he supposed. If this had been happening a month or two ago, before he went to the library for the first time, he probably would have freaked out over the prospect of meeting a sentient quirk. As it was, though, he simply waved and said, "Hi. I'm Midoriya Izuku, what's your name?" Instead of answering his question, however, they turned to face Tokoyami, and with a huge grin said, "He's so nice. We're keeping him." Tokoyami gave an exhausted sigh and said, "No, Dark Shadow. We cannot keep people. He has a dark journey of his own." Izuku gave an owlish blink, and pointed to his chest, confused. "Me? I didn't really do much of anything nice. I just introduced myself." "Well, yeah, but most people get weirded out by that fact that I'm a sentient quirk. That, or they just act like I'm not here." The quirk, presumably Dark Shadow, responded. Izuku found himself feeling angry at that. Not at Dark Shadow and Tokoyami, but at the people who had rejected them just because of the way they were. "Well, that's not right. They shouldn't treat you guys like that." Dark Shadow nodded to themselves. "We're keeping him." "No, we aren't." By the time Izuku got home, it was almost sundown, and he had obtained Tokoyami's phone number. Izuku and Inko both sat at the table, eating dinner together. The food was a bit cold, as Inko had finished it before Izuku got home, but it still tasted good. He sighed as he put his chopsticks down, staring at his plate. Now would be the best time to tell her his decision. "Mom? You know how you were talking about online school earlier? Izuku asked, and she nodded, swallowing her food. I think I want to try it. But just for this year because I want to at least try to get into UA once high school starts. It took a week for his mom to finish setting up the online schooling for him, as well as take him out of Aldra to enroll him in the new school. That week was rather uneventful, though, and before long, it was over. It was about time to start a new chapter of his life. After all, he had around 9 months before UA's entrance exam, and he needed to train for it. It was the day Izuku started his online schooling, and he was currently in the library, working on his assignments. His mom still had to go to work, so he didn't really see a point in staying at home to do his schoolwork. And besides, once he was finished, he could practice copying other quirks again. He wasn't sure he quite understood his abilities yet. He didn't know what kind of limits his copying had, and what kind of side effects he might get from overusing it. Although, would he actually get any side effects? After all, he was the quirk, in a way, meaning the way his abilities worked might be different from other copy quirks. Actually, did copy quirks get drawbacks from overuse? He'd never really seen anyone with a copy quirk before, so he never got the chance to analyze them. Obviously, it would make sense for any drawbacks from quirks he'd copied to transfer over, but were there drawbacks to pushing his copying past his limits? And what limits were they? Could he copy multiple quirks at once? How long could he copy a quirk for? What were the requirements for copying a quirk? Aren't you supposed to be doing your schoolwork, not analyzing yourself? Chiesa asked from behind him. Izuku jumped a bit in surprise and turned to look at her. Was I really muttering again? She nodded. Yeah, you were. Sorry, didn't mean to startle you. Do you need any help with your school stuff, or are you just excited about practicing? I'm just excited. I mean, I'm so used to being quirkless, so the idea of being able to copy quirks now. It's just really exciting. He replied, earning a smile from her. Well, once you finish your schoolwork, you can practice all you want. I'd tell you more about your abilities, but... Well, we didn't exactly get to learn much about what you could do, since there weren't many quirks back then, she said, ruffling his already messy hair. Izuku nodded. That's fine. Experimenting with my abilities will be fun. Chiesa chuckled at his excitement, and gave him a thumbs up as she walked away, leaving Izuku to finish his schoolwork for the day. It wasn't too hard to do, and he finished in a decent amount of time. He closed his computer once he had finished, and stood up, stretching. He moved a bit away from the table, not wanting to ruin it by accident. But what should he try to practice first? He needed to figure out his limits before he could try to train to push past them, but what first? He didn't want to start with trying to find out his time limit, because not only would that risk tiring him out completely, but it also meant that depending on his time limit, he'd run out of time to practice. It would probably be smartest to figure out the requirements for copying other quirks. Otherwise, he might go into battle unprepared because he couldn't copy a quirk for some reason. Let's see, what was a common factor between all the quirks he's copied so far? So far, he's copied Dragon Lash, Fierce Wings, Explosion, and Fold a Body. Well, they all were sort of dragonish in a way, but that definitely wasn't it. The only other similarity he could think of was that he knew what all of them did. So then he should try to copy a quirk he didn't know about. His best bet would be to try to copy one of the other quirks who went to the library. While he had talked to most of them and knew some of their names, he didn't know what they actually did, so it was his best bet, other than just going out and trying to copy a stranger's quirk. Some of the quirks had really descriptive names that easily gave away what they did, though, so he should try to copy one who had a vague name. But who? He looked around the room, before his eyes landed on one of the quirks sitting alone at a table. Their name was Power, and they were possibly the most cryptid quirk Izuku would ever meet. He knew absolutely nothing about them other than their name, but somehow they seemed to know almost everything about him. Of course, that might just be because they knew him in his past life, but Izuku figured that he would probably recognize them at least a little bit if that was the case. Anyways, he didn't know anything about them, so they would be the best quirk for Izuku to try to copy at the moment. Izuku squinted his eyes shut, and tried to imagine himself copying Power, just like how he did for any other quirk, but it just didn't work. He opened his eyes up, and nothing had happened. So then he needed to know what a quirk did in order to copy them. Okay, now that he had settled that, he should try to see if he could copy 2 different quirks at once. Arbor and Bubble could work. He tried to imagine himself with the 2 quirks, and as soon as he did, a pain scream ripped its way out of his throat, and he collapsed onto the floor, clawing at his hair. His head was pounding. It was as if someone was repeatedly whacking it with a sledgehammer over and over and over, and it felt like he was being torn in 2. He kept his eyes shut tight, the pressure behind them so intense that he didn't want to open them. His nose burned and he swore could feel warm liquid dripping out. He wanted to cry so badly, but he couldn't open his eye to do so, and they burned and he wanted it to stop. He could feel tendrils coming out of him, but he didn't know what they were unless they were from Arbor. He could hear 2 pairs of footsteps coming towards him, and familiar voices talking, but it hurt so much and he couldn't identify who they were or what they were saying. Someone's hand gripped his arms gently and pulled his hands away from his head, which lessened the pain a little bit. Had he been tugging at his hair? The familiar voices continued talking, and he heard the door opening, followed by more footsteps running over and another familiar voice. The footsteps changed direction after a different voice said something though, and then the pain started to get worse and worse, and another pained cry pushed its way out of him, and he folded over on himself. One of the familiar voices left, and then the other one came back, and suddenly a soft blanket was draped over his shoulders. Then the other one came back, and the voices started talking again, but he still couldn't tell what they were saying. Then he felt something, probably a tissue, being pressed up against his nose, as if to stop the liquid from coming out of it. That was about when he passed out. One for all sighed as she looked at her little brother, saddened by the state he'd been put into. He had fallen over when he passed out, so he was now curled up on the floor, his old green blanket wrapped around him, and a bloody tissue on his nose. Ayaka stood across from her, and a dragon-like quirk she didn't know was kneeling in front of him. Some bubbles floated about the area, and tables and bookshelves had been knocked down from Arbor. I thought he was dead. She mumbled, and Ayaka nodded. He was. This is his reincarnation. He goes by Midoriya Izuku now. She responded. The dragon-like quirk slowly pulled him up into a sitting position, and held his shoulders to keep him there. Geez, what did he even do? They muttered, and Ayaka shrugged, shaking her head. We can ask him later, she said, before crouching down to his right, and wrapping his arm around her neck. Bulb-chan, could you grab his other arm? We need to get him to a hospital. Bulb was a nickname that Ayaka used for her, although she didn't really know why she used that particular one. She nodded and did so, and the 2 of them worked together to take him to Ayaka's car, and put him in the back seat. Ayaka walked over to the driver's side and said, Do you want to come too? You'll have to stay hidden, of course, but... Yeah, I think I should come. I need to talk to him when he wakes up. Izuku's vision slowly returned, instantly met with an almost blinding white. The light from it hurt, and he instantly squeezed his eyes shut again. Machines beeped near him, adding to the dull throbbing in his head. There was pressure on his finger for something, and there was some sort of tube in his arm. It probably took him longer than it should have to realize that he was in a hospital. Before that, it was mostly just wishing that the beeping and the throbbing would stop. It took a while before he decided to open his eyes again as well. The light still hurt, but he chose to ignore that for the moment. But once he managed to come to the conclusion of where he was, he wanted to figure out why he was there. Which, of course, led to him remembering what had happened earlier. He had tried to copy the quirks at once, and then, it all started to hurt, and he had felt as if he was being torn apart by the 2 quirks. Did that normally happen when people with copy quirks tried to copy multiple quirks at once? Or had it been because he was the quirk? He didn't know. He did know, however, that he never wanted to do that again. Maybe copying quirks was fun and exciting and amazing, but what had happened from trying to copy 2 quirks was anything but. It was an experience he never wanted to go through again, and an experience he wished he never went through in the first place. However, he had went through it. But, well, he supposed now he knew, at least. Now he knew that trying to copy multiple quirks was overwhelming, and he shouldn't do it anymore. There was a sudden knocking on the door, snapping him out of his thoughts. This was followed by Chesa walking in, gently shutting the door behind her. "Oh, thank God you're awake." Izuku's head whipped around to look at her, taking in her concerned yet hopeful expression. He smiled at her. "Kiyasa-chan? Where's Mom? She's not here yet?" She wanted to stay overnight, but the doctors wouldn't let her. "Bulb is here, though, but I think she's asleep," Chesa said, smiling softly as she walked over to his bed. He looked at her, confusion etched into his expression. "What do you mean, overnight? And who's Bulb?" Chesa chuckled to herself, shaking her head. "Right, you don't remember. Bulb is what I call one for all. As for the overnight part, well, you've been asleep for 17 hours. Izuku chose to ignore the last part, instead saying, "Nichan's here? But you said you haven't seen her in years. And she's here." She nodded. "Yeah, she came to the library yesterday while, well, you know. She's invisible right now, since no one's supposed to know about her, but she's here. I've already told her that you don't remember anything, so be ready for her to tell you a bunch of stories about what we did together. Also, she might call you Mimi. It's a nickname she used to call you by." Izuku nodded, and they fell into silence. He was, admittedly, excited to actually meet his sister, but with the pounding in his head it was hard for him to actually focus on it, or much of anything for that matter. Eventually, though, a question popped into his head, which he immediately blurted out. "How much of it do they know?" She looked a bit surprised by the question for a moment, but she didn't take long to answer. "I told them that I saw you in the middle of a migraine at the park, and I brought you here when you passed out. I didn't tell them what had caused it, which is partially because I'm not entirely sure myself, but I'm guessing it had to do with you copying multiple quirks." He nodded in response. "Yeah. I was trying to test the limits on what I could do. Should have expected there to be some sort of backlash, honestly. Don't beat yourself up over it, Midoriya-kun. There's no way we could have known that this would happen. After all, we never really got the chance to test out exactly what you could do back then." She replied, gently ruffling his hair. "I'd suggest that you tell them what caused it, though. That way they can help you better. As far as I'm aware, there's no reason for you to keep it secret." Chiesa continued, and Izuku nodded. She was right. The only reason he hadn't told anyone yet was that he never really had gotten a good chance. Either he forgot to tell Inko, or she was doing something else already. They went silent again for a moment, which was about when One for All became visible, standing right next to Issa. "Mimi! It's been so long." Despite her clear excitement, she kept her voice low. Izuku couldn't help the tears that welled up in his eyes when he saw her, despite never seeing her in his life before. She was a stranger to him, but at the same time, she was his sister. Tears started to stream down his cheeks, and in a voice barely more than a whisper, he said, "Ning, Adash. It's nice to see you, to us." It always had been, ever since he went to the library for the first time. Ever since that day, his worldview had been flipped on its head, again and again. He learned that quirks could be given, or taken. He learned that somehow, people did care about how he was treated, enough that Bakugu had been banned from UA. He learned that he was the reincarnation of a sentient copy quirk. He learned that he had 2 older siblings, one good and one evil. He learned that he could copy quirks. But none of that was quite like seeing his sister in person for the first time. He was at a loss for words. What was he supposed to say? One for Osmo Nichan. He liked Nichan better. Nichan teared up too, but he could tell that they were happy tears. She was smiling at him, a smile even brighter than All Might's and more real too. It was strange having someone smile at him like that. He smiled back. Her smile was infectious, he couldn't help it. She launched herself at him, though she was careful not to mess with any of the machines attached to him. Her arms wrapped around his torso in a bear hug, and after a moment he hugged her back, tears streaming down even more. They stayed like that for a while, seconds, minutes, Izuku couldn't say. Chesa was silent throughout it all, giving the sibling quirks their space. It was weird to think of himself like that too. He was a quirk. Most of the time, he didn't think about it all that much, but sometimes, like now, he would have the sudden realization that, hey, this is real. I'm a quirk. A complete change from before, when he thought that he was quirkless. Nachan separated from him eventually, and as she did, footsteps from outside began heading in the direction to Izuku's hospital room. She smiled sadly. Looks like I have to go invisible for now. We can catch up later at the library, alright Mimi? Why yeah. He responded, wiping at his tears in an attempt to dry them as she faded away. Moments after he had mostly dried his tears, the door swung open, revealing a worried-looking Inko. She teared up when she saw him, awake and sitting up, which made Izuku tear up once more. Just the same as Nachan did, she ran up to him and hugged him, while crying out, "Izuku! My baby!" He flinched at the volume of it, and a nurse came in soon after. "Don't be so loud. He just had a migraine, so he'll probably still be a bit sensitive to loud sounds." "Oh, I'm sorry Izuku, I didn't mean to dash," Inko started, only for Izuku to cut her off. "It's alright Mum. You didn't know. Honestly, I didn't realize it either." Inko pulled away from him, and the nurse spoke up again. "Is it alright if I ask you a few questions, so we can find out what happened?" Izuku nodded slowly, and she began asking him questions as she checked his vitals. Izuku answered them almost completely honestly, although he lied about how it had happened in the park, rather than admitting that it occurred in the library. After all, no human other than Chiesa knew about it, so it was better that he just say that he had been practicing with his abilities in the park. Inko seemed happy for him when he said that he could now copy quirks, which wasn't very surprising. She knew how bad things had been for him while he was quirkless. The doctor came and went, ushering everyone else out when he was done checking up on Izuku. Something about how Izuku needed space in order to recover. Leaving Izuku alone with his thoughts in the hospital room. Izuku was released a couple of hours after he had woken up, and by that point, the pain had mostly subsided. He went home with Inko, texting Tokoyami while she drove the car. He figured that Inko would probably want to keep him in the house for a while after that had happened. The doctors had given him a prescription for migraine medicine, but they had also said that it was probably an effect of overusing his quirk, so he should be fine as long as he didn't do it again. Not like he planned to do it again. That was not at all a pleasant experience. But, despite what had just happened, there was a giddy feeling in his chest, and he couldn't help the small grin that appeared on his face. He'd just met Nachan for the first time. And she had promised that once he recovered, they could talk to each other again, which was something he'd be looking forward to. He'd never really had someone who he could consider as family before, he realized. His mom was nice, sure, and while she clearly cared about him, she just never really supported him in his dreams, and that hurt. He never really managed to consider Auntie Mitsuki and Uncle Marisa as family, despite his nicknames for them. He only ever saw them when Bakugo was also around, and Bakugo being there made it. Chiesa and Tokoyami weren't family either, just friends. And Bakugo. He didn't want to think about Bakugo. He wasn't entirely sure that he'd be able to get that kind of thing from Nachan either, honestly. After all, that was his first time meeting her. At least, in this life. Nachan already recognized him as her little brother, though, and he referred to her as Nachan, not because he had to but because it felt right. Sure, he was worried that things wouldn't be the same as they were in his last life, seeing as he had completely different memories, and experience shaped the person. He might be different than how she remembered him, or maybe he had stayed the same but she changed and no longer would get along with him. But mostly he was excited. He wasn't sure what was causing it, perhaps the traces of his past life left in his mind, or maybe just the concept of having an older sister he could look up to, but a feeling of warmth and comfort made itself home in his mind whenever he so much as thought of their brief conversation in the hospital. It was nice and he wanted more of it. There was a part of his mind filled with half-forgotten memories of what they did together, the sensation of her playing with his hair in order to soothe him to sleep, words that she had said to him. It was there, he knew it was, he just couldn't fully recall it. They might have come from his dreams, or they might have always been there, and he was only now realizing it. After all, he'd always been Mimic. He just didn't realize it before. He was glad that he had found out, though. His life had always seemed just a tad brighter after he had arrived at the library for the first time. His phone buzzed in his hand, alerting him that Tokoyami had responded, and pulling him out of his thoughts. Hopefully, Inko wouldn't insist on keeping him inside for too long. It was only a day later when Izuku returned to the library. He had spent most of the day he got home resting, but now he was ready to go back to the library, and so he did. As soon as he entered the library, all the other quirks inside came over, checking to see if he was all right and such. He wasn't very close with most of them, but they still seemed to care about him despite that, though it might be because of how fond Chiesa was of him. Once he had managed to convince the others that, really, it's fine now. It won't happen again, things calmed down again, and everyone went back to what they were doing before. As soon as that happened, Izuku spotted Nichan, talking to Asa. He wasn't sure what had possessed him to do it, but as soon as he saw her, he called out, "Nichan," just before running at her and hugging her. Asa chuckled and Nichan ruffled his hair. "Hey there, Mimi. You feeling better?" "Yep," he chirped, smiling at her. Not 2 seconds later did he realize what had just happened, and instantly let go of her. "I'm sorry I didn't know we had that was sorry of Mimi and just interrupted our conversation and de shold vist before a higidio dash. Hey, slow down Mimi, you need to breath, remember?" Izuku promptly took a huge gulp of air, nodding. "Right, sorry? Well, I'm glad you're feeling better now." Nichan grinned, ruffling his hair once again. "Now, I believe we have a lot of catching up to do." And so they did. Izuku went first, since he was younger and therefore it wouldn't take as long for him to finish. He made sure to be brief about it, though. His life wasn't exactly good, and he didn't want to make Nichan sad by telling her about it. Once he had finished, Nichan began to summarize everything that had happened to them. How he had been created by All for One by mashing together a copy quirk and a quirk that made objects sentient, how he had tried to prevent their family from splitting up, how they met Chiesa in a Denny's parking lot at 2 a.m., how the three of them worked together to build the library, how he had disappeared one day, only for them to later find a note that he had written saying that he was probably dead. She didn't linger on that for very long, instead moving on to tell him various stories of things they did together, such as the one time they had a shopping cart race in the grocery store. "I don't know how you two managed to talk me into that." Chiesa chimed in, to which Nichan shrugged. Nichan then turned to him and loudly whispered, "It was your puppy dog eyes. Only a monster could resist those." He blinked at her, tilting his head slightly. "I have puppy dog eyes. I am going to teach you how to do them later, don't worry." Nichan affirmed, nodding to herself. Chiesa groaned in the background. "Okay." Izuku chose to ignore Chiesa's protests of him learning the puppy dog eyes, because it was apparently how he and Nichan got away with half of the crazy things they got up to. How many of those things were his idea? Izuku had no clue. He didn't think he wanted to ask, though. He walked out of the library with a wide grin, completely ignoring the strange looks he got from walking out of thin air. He was well used to them by now. Meeting Nichan had been better than he ever could have thought of, and he was just so happy. She had been so much fun to talk to, and she had lots of interesting stories as well. Most of which made Chiesa roll her eyes in a way that said, "These idiots are lucky that I love them." Nichan said that she was being a mom. Nichan hadn't taught him how to do the puppy dog eyes yet, but he had a feeling that he could count on it happening. Currently, he was making his way to the local cafe. Tokoyami had requested that they meet up there, and Izuku had seen no reason to say no to it. The cafe was nice, so he figured it would be a good place to meet with a friend. Well, he liked to think that he and Tokoyami were friends, anyways. He entered the cafe, and found his way to an empty booth, waiting for Tokoyami to show up. As soon as the bird-headed boy entered the cafe, Izuku called out, "Hey Tokoyami! Over here!" Izuku was sobbing when he woke up. For the first few seconds, he wasn't entirely sure why he was crying, but he couldn't make it stop. Then memories of the dream he'd had that night pried their way into his mind, and the tears fell harder. He remembered leaving a note on the library's desk, a note he didn't dare look at. He remembered sneaking out of the library in the middle of the night, anxiously looking over his shoulder to make sure no one was watching. He remembered running as soon as he was out of the library, urgency filling every step. He remembered that he was looking for someone, that he had something important to tell them before it was too late. He remembered his legs getting weaker underneath him, yet he continued on anyway. He remembered his body becoming transparent, causing his urgency to grow stronger. He remembered collapsing onto the floor, legs unable to carry him further. He remembered crying out, in pain and in sadness. He remembered feeling like he had failed, but he had no idea what he had failed. He remembered that his hands were almost completely see-through. Then he woke up. He wanted to tell himself that it was just some horrible nightmare, it wasn't real and it hadn't happened. But he knew who he was. He was Izuku Midoriya, the reincarnation of Mimic. Once a sentient copy quirk that lived in the dawn of quirks, now a teenage half-quirk living in a world where quirks dominated everything. He knew that in his past life, he died because he didn't have a host. He knew that he sometimes got memories of his past life in the form of dreams. He knew that his nightmares were never anything like the dream he had just had. The conclusion he came to wasn't one he liked to think about. Those were his dying moments in his past life. Other than it being a bizarre nightmare, that was the only conclusion that made sense. Part of him wanted to pretend that was all it was. A bizarre nightmare, something his mind had made up to scare him. But he never had nightmares like that, and he had no idea why he would. While he sometimes felt guilty about how he had left Chiesa in his past life, he'd figure that a nightmare about that would be different. Plus, he doesn't live in the library, so there was no reason he'd be sneaking out of it in the middle of the night. But in his past life, he had lived in the library. He knew that he had been in his old bedroom before. The tears eventually ran out, but the memory of it lingered in his mind, along with a question. Who had he been looking for? After the dream, things continued on as normal. He continued to go to the library and do his schoolwork. When he finished his homework, he hung out with Nichan and the other quirks. Sometimes he would practice copying quirks, though he found that there wasn't much to practice. There were only 2 limits on his ability to copy quirks. He needed to know about the quirk, and copying 2 quirks at once was agonizing. He never told anyone about the dream. He didn't tell Inko or Tokoyami because he couldn't. They didn't know that he was a sentient quirk, they couldn't know. Letting people know what he was would lead to them finding out about his siblings, and both of them were national secrets. Letting people know would lead to them trying to make him into their quirk. Maybe Inko and Tokoyami wouldn't do such a thing, but others would. He didn't tell Chiesa or Nichan because he knew that the subject of his death was uncomfortable for them. They didn't say it, but they didn't have to. He could tell. He didn't tell the other quirks because if he did, Chiesa or Nichan would eventually find out, which would defeat the purpose of telling the other quirks about it instead of one of them. So no one knew that he had a dream recounting his last moments in his past life. No one but him. That made it hard to figure out exactly what had happened, though. He had a good guess as to what the note had said, as well as the message he was trying to deliver, but who had he been looking for? And why had he needed to sneak out to find that person? He had no way of answering those questions. He couldn't look it up, the world didn't even know Mimic ever existed. He couldn't read about it in one of the library's books, none of the books had anything to do with his past life, and he was fairly sure that he didn't have a diary. If he had, it would have been in his old bedroom. Since he had no way of answering them, he tried not to think about them too much. A hard feat, considering his natural curiosity. That, along with what the dream had been about. Ignoring thoughts involving a dream about his last moments proved to be rather difficult. He'd manage it. Tokoyami was unsure what to make of Midoriya. Midoriya wasn't like anyone he had encountered before. Most people feared him for his lack of control over Dark Shadow, and those who didn't fear him, pitied him. Most people ignored the fact that Dark Shadow was their own being, and those who didn't ignore their sentience treated them as if they were a monster. Most everyone was off-put by either his bird head or the way he spoke and dressed. Midoriya did none of those things. He didn't care that Tokoyami couldn't control Dark Shadow. He treated Dark Shadow as a friend just as much as he treated Tokoyami as one. He wasn't off-put by Tokoyami's bird head, and in fact found it as super cool looking. Tokoyami didn't understand why. What made Midoriya so different from everyone else? Even his parents didn't like him because of Dark Shadow, who was an unexplained mutation of a quirk that couldn't have come from anywhere within the family. When Midoriya blinded him and Dark Shadow with a smile as bright as the sun, the two of them came to a simple conclusion. Midoriya Izuku was an angel. You're telling me All Might is your host? Izuku yelped after a few seconds of silence. Nichan had been telling him a story about her current host's debut, a story that Izuku had easily recognized from all the times he rewatched the video of All Might's debut. Nichan chuckled, nodding, "I guess I forgot to tell you that, huh?" Izuku nodded, torn between rambling about how cool being All Might's quirk must be and feeling sad about how his encounter with All Might had turned out. It must have shown on his expression, because her expression turned soft. "Hey, what's wrong, Mimi?" He looked away from her, fidgeting with the hem of his shirt. It was stupid, really. It shouldn't matter anymore. He might not have a quirk, but he was able to copy them, and everyone else thought that copying quirks was his quirk, so it should be fine. It shouldn't matter that All Might said quirkless people couldn't be heroes, because he had his copying ability now. Plus, Chiesa had said that she thought he could be a hero, with or without a quirk. But it still hurt, and he didn't know why. Izuku never answered Nichan's question. He didn't know what was wrong. He knew it was because of what All Might had said to him, but he didn't know what was making it hurt still. Tears poured down his cheeks, prompting Nichan to engulf him in a hug, whispering reassurances to him. And maybe she had figured out what it was because she said, "I think you'll make a great hero, Mimi." He cried harder after that, but those tears were happy tears. It was 2 months after he had met Tokoyami, and 7 months away from the entrance exam when it happened. Izuku, Tokoyami, and Dark Shadow were sitting in a tree, same as they had when they first met, talking about the recent documentary on Gothic-themed heroes. In the middle of Izuku's rambling, Dark Shadow blurted out, "You're a sentient quirk. Like me." The statement startled Izuku enough that he fell out of the tree. "Ow." Tokoyami climbed out of the tree and helped Izuku up. "Are you all right?" Yeah, I'm fine," he replied, brushing the dust off himself. "Thanks for helping me up, Tokoyami." But, why would you say something like that, Dark Shadow-kun? I'm human, you know that." Dark Shadow shook their head rapidly. "No, you are. I dunno how I didn't notice it before, but you have the same energy as a sentient quirk." Wait, do you have a host? Are you dying?" "What? No, I'm fine, I'm not dying." Izuku waved his hands around wildly before pausing. "Wait. What do you mean, I have the same energy as a sentient quirk?" Tokoyami nodded in agreement. "I would also like to know what you mean, my shadowy friend. It's kinda weird? But, us sentient quirks can sorta just tell if someone else is a sentient quirk because we just give off a different energy, I guess? I don't know why you wouldn't know about that, though, since you're one of us," Dark Shadow explained, the last part clearly directed at Izuku. Izuku paused for a moment, thinking. He could tell them that he wasn't a sentient quirk and say that's why he didn't know about it. But he was friends with them, wasn't he? And plus, Dark Shadow was a quirk like him, and Tokoyami was their host. Both of them seemed trustworthy enough. Except he wasn't really supposed to tell anyone about his past. Mimic was supposed to be a secret, same with his older siblings. But he could tell them the truth without spilling his secrets, couldn't he? Yeah, I'm a sentient quirk without a host. But don't tell anyone, okay? I don't really want people knowing," Izuku said, rubbing the back of his neck. Tokoyami nodded. "I will take your secret to the grave." "I mean okay, but you don't have a host. That's not good, you'll end up fading." Dark Shadow responded, making hand gestures to emphasize their point. Izuku shook his head. No, it's fine really. I can handle myself. Plus, if I do get close to fading, I have options. So please don't worry about it, okay?" Dark Shadow seemed reluctant at first, but they nodded. "All right if you say so." After that day, nothing very eventful happened. Izuku continued to work on his copying, applying his analysis to the quirks when he copied them. He didn't need to train his copying itself too much, but his control over quirks he copied had needed a bit of attention, some more than others. He had grown closer with Tokoyami and Dark Shadow after sharing his secret with them, although they still didn't know the full truth. It was unlikely that they would ask about it any further, though, as they didn't really have any reason to suspect there was anything more to it. From what he had heard, Bakugo had been training hard for the Shiketsu entrance exam. He hadn't seen him training, of course, But Izuku had found himself avoiding Bakugo now that he actually could. He had also been spending more time with Nichan lately, which was nice. But now, it was the day before Yue's entrance exam. He paced around one of the tables at the library nervously, mumbling to himself. Chiesa chuckled, pulling him out of his thoughts. "You'll do fine, Izuku." Nichan nodded along with a grin. "I'll be cheering for ya, Mimi." Izuku paused but slowly nodded. "Right. Yeah, I'll be fine. I can do this." It was nice to have people who believed in him. Izuku sat on the train, which surprisingly wasn't very full. Then again, it was still early in the morning, so even though there'd be a lot of people wanting to get to the entrance exams, most of them would be coming later on. However, he had gotten on earlier so that way he'd have more time to go over his quirk notes. While his memory was great, and he probably didn't need to review his quirk notes, he was anxious, and looking them over again would help soothe his nerves. He got off at his stop, and began jogging up to UA. The gates were open today, since it was exam day, so he didn't have to worry about being locked outside because he got there early. Once he was on campus, he found a bench to sit on, and pulled out his notebook. It was number 14, his most recent one after 13 had been ruined. He sat there for a while, going through all the different quirks he had written notes on, when at some point he noticed somebody going to sit at the bench across from him. He subtly looked over the edge of his notebook to try to see what the person looked like. He was a tall, muscular-looking boy with especially strong-looking legs. Engines poked out of his legs, explaining why they looked so strong. He had a square sort of face with square glasses to match. His eyes and short hair were both a navy blue color. Izuku wasn't incredibly focused on his appearance, however. He was more focused on the engines in the boy's legs, clearly his quirk. They were familiar seeming, as if he'd copied a quirk like it in the past. Engines. Quirks. Ingenium. You're related to Ingenium, Izuku exclaimed, seemingly shocking the other boy. His mouth hung slightly open as he stared at Izuku, as if he was surprised that Izuku came to such a conclusion. After a few seconds, the boy shut his mouth, only to open it again and say, Yes, I am Ingenium's younger brother. My name is Ida Tenya. That must be so cool. Oh, I'm Midoriya Izuku, he responded, smiling softly. He had been a bit worried that declaring something like that might get a negative reaction, but it seems like it hadn't, luckily. Ida nodded proudly. Yes, indeed. Being the younger brother of Ingenium is quite an honor. Although I am curious, how did you figure it out? Oh, well, the engines gave it away. I like to study quirks a lot, so it wasn't too hard to realize that your engines are a lot like Ingenium's, he said, rubbing the back of his neck sheepishly. Ida gave a considerate hum before nodding. I see. That does make sense. And it's nice to meet someone else who enjoys studying as well. The two of them continued talking for a while, and eventually more people started arriving, although it was still only a few. The crowd started to get larger, and at some point, Izuku saw a familiar bird head moving around. Fumi-kun. Blacklight-kun. Over here. Zuku. Dark Shadow called in response. At the same time Fumikage said, Greetings, friend. When Fumikage was closer, Izuku ran up to him and pulled him over to where Ida was sat. Guys, this is Ida Tenya. We met this morning, we're friends now. Ida-san, this is Tokoyami Fumikage and Dark Shadow, they're my best friends. It is nice to meet you both. Ida said, adjusting his glasses. Fumikage nodded. I see you have been bathed in Izuku's light as well. Ida looked confused for a moment, before Dark Shadow piped up. He just means that Zuku likes you. They continued talking for a little bit longer, before Ida had said that it was almost time for the written portion to begin, and they should head out to the auditorium. In reality, they had at least another half hour, but none of them realized that until after they had gotten to the auditorium. The written exam came and went, and Izuku actually felt pretty confident in his results. He'd been moving through his online classes at a pretty fast rate and had gotten a few weeks into the high school curriculum, so he knew the answers to most of the academic questions, and the heroics-related questions were easy enough with all his analysis. Then Present Mike came up to the stage. Hello, little listeners. Welcome to the practical exam. Can I get a yeah? Izuku did not hesitate in replying, under the assumption that everyone else would reply too. Everyone else did not respond, and suddenly the half-quirk was the center of attention. He sunk into his seat, and Fumikage patted his shoulder in sympathy while Dark Shadow seemed to be restraining laughter. Izuku gave them a half-hearted glare, which only got more stifled giggles. "Thank you, little listener," Present Mike called out, practically beaming at him. Before Izuku could even process it, Present Mike had moved on. "Before we begin the exam, I'm here to explain the rules. It's pretty simple. In this test, there are 3 different types of robots. Each one is worth a different amount of points. In order to pass, you need to get as many points as possible by destroying the robots. And of course, there will be no playing anti-hero, so don't go attacking other examinees. Are there any questions?" Ida's hand shot up. "Present Mike, this packet shows 4 robots, while you said that there were only 3. We should be able to expect better from UA than such mistakes." Present Mike nodded. "Don't worry about that one, it's the 0-pointer. You don't get anything out of destroying it, so just think of it as an obstacle. Anybody else?" There were a few other questions, but soon enough they finished up, and Present Mike said, "Now that that's out of the way, let's get this exam started. Can I get a plus ultra?" Once again, Izuku shouted back in response, but apart from Dark Shadow, a reluctant Fumikage, and a couple others in the crowd, no one responded. Izuku stood amongst the crowd of students, mumbling to himself as he waited for Present Mike to start the test. He wasn't sure where Ida and Fumikage went, but he trusted that they'd be able to deal with the test on their own. Honestly, they'd probably do better than him, seeing as he only had his copying ability for around 10 months. His plan was relatively simple. He would rush in using Ingenium's engine quirk in order to get himself more time, and then once he encountered a robot, he'd copy 13's black hole quirk. He wasn't all too sure that it would work. Ingenium seemed to have a hard time with turning and braking when at his full speed, and 13's quirk could be extremely dangerous if it wasn't used right, but it was what he had managed to come up with for now. Besides, as long as he only targeted the robots, it should be fine. Present Mike called "Go," and in an instant, everyone took off. He quickly copied Ingenium's quirk, the engines easily popping out of his elbows, and started to use the quirk, zooming ahead of the others. It seemed that Ida had the same idea, to no surprise. He gave a loose grin and a 2-fingered salute as he ran next to Ida, who looked more than a bit surprised. Then, he tumbled onto a different street to look for robots. The test went well for a while. He wasn't sure exactly how many points he had, but it was definitely more than he had been expecting to get. He also managed to save a few people trapped under rubble like 13 did, which, while it wouldn't help him in the long run, felt pretty nice. He didn't even hurt anyone by accident. Then, the ground started to rumble. Hesitantly, he turned around to look behind him, only to see a giant robot stomping through the city. Nope. He turned to run away like the other examinees were, but then he heard a yell, "Help me!" Despite the fact that there was a chance of being crushed by the 0-pointer, Izuku could not ignore someone who needed help. So, he ran over to the sound of the call, only to find a brunette girl trapped under the rubble. She looked sick, as if she would throw up at any moment. Probably quirk exhaustion. Using his copy of Black Hole, he removed the rubble from her body before turning the quirk off again. "Can you walk?" She shook her head. "My ankle." Sure enough, one of her ankles was sprained. He picked her up and made his way towards the entrance of the city. Recovery Girl would be there once the exam ended, and she could help this girl. At some point, the girl threw up on his shoes, but he didn't pay much attention to it. He could deal with it later. Present Mike called the end of the exam, and Izuku dropped the girl off at Recovery Girl's medical station. As he walked up to the front of the school, he was rejoined by Ida and Fumikage. Together they went back to the train station and went their separate ways. Izuku walked along the sidewalk on his way back to the apartment. He had been planning on spending some more time at the library, but everyone had seemed so excited but at the same time secretive, and it had been a bit unnerving. Even Nichan had seemed keen on not talking to him about whatever was making her so excited. He trusted them, how could he not? But Well, it had been unsettling enough that he decided to just go spend some quality time with his mom. It had been a while since he spent time with her, anyways. He wasn't too sure what they had seemed so excited about, but with day it was, he had to wonder if it had something to do with his score on the entrance exam. It was around the time they'd be receiving their letters, after all. Except, he had no idea how they'd possibly know his results, so it seemed unlikely. So, he had no idea what it could possibly have been about. Izuku made his way home and helped his mom make dinner, katsudon, his favorite. Then, once they finished dinner, they huddled up on the couch to watch one of those dramas that his mom liked so much, when he received a text from Tokoyami, saying that he had passed the exam and asking if Izuku had gotten his results. Izuku replied to tell him that he hadn't, and during one of the commercial breaks, he got up to go see if it had arrived yet. He found the letter in the mailbox, very clearly from UA. He plucked it out and rushed back inside. "Mom, it's here. Is it all right if I go read it in my room?" "Sure, sweetie. Just come tell me the results when you're done, okay?" She responded. Izuku called an affirmative back, before rushing into his room, plopping onto the bed as he tore the envelope open, only to find some sort of disc inside of it. No letter in sight, though. On the center of the disc was a button, and out of curiosity he pressed it, only to throw the disc to the ground as a projection showed up from it. "I am here, as a hologram." All Might shouted, and Izuku had half the urge to throw a pillow at the projection in shock. Those things should have come with warnings. All Might continued on, oblivious to Izuku's surprise. "Your scores in the written exam were quite impressive, young Midoriya. You got 99% on the test, which would be enough to pass on its own if you had applied for general studies." Izuku had to wonder if All Might was trying to subtly tell him to transfer to general studies, but, wait, All Might had recorded the videos for the entrance exam results, which meant Nachan would know his results. So it was why they had seemed so excited back at the library. All Might continued, "As for the practical, you got a score of 45 villain points. But that's not all. Not only does UA count points for destroying villains, but also the hidden point system, rescue points. For your heroic actions, you have 65 rescue points, giving you a total of 110 points, and placing you first in the entrance exam. Congratulations, young Midoriya, and welcome to your Hero Academy." The hologram faded, and Izuku could feel tears starting to form in his eyes. He did it. He had actually done it. He was going to be a hero. He opened his bedroom door, and said just loud enough for Inko to hear, "I passed." Toshinori was concerned, to say the least. As he had watched the entrance exam, he noticed something so very wrong. Young Midoriya had a quirk. He remembered the boy, of course. It would have been irresponsible to have simply forgotten about him, considering that he had told the boy one of his biggest secrets. Naturally, he also remembered why he had told young Midoriya. The boy wanted to know if he could be a quirkless hero. The only reason someone would ask that question was if either they were quirkless, or their quirk was simply too dangerous to use. And a copy quirk like the one young Midoriya had displayed was not dangerous, unless you counted the fact that it gave young Midoriya a horrid migraine if he overused it, but every quirk had its drawbacks. Meaning that when young Midoriya had asked him the question, he had been quirkless, which matched up with what the quirk registration said. Which was worrying because he very clearly had a quirk now. Quirks didn't come in that late, unless they were either developed by a high-stress situation, or had very specific activation requirements. Neither of those were true for young Midoriya. He had randomly developed the quirk in the park, and started experimenting with it when he got backlash from it, and was taken to the hospital after passing out. A very blatant lie, but one no one would bother double-checking as he had been to the hospital after the matter, and the woman who took him to the hospital had made the claim long before young Midoriya had. Plus, to most it was the only explanation that made sense. But Toshinori knew otherwise. Young Midoriya must have gotten his quirk from All for One. It didn't make sense at first. All for One was supposed to be dead, and young Midoriya seemed too heroic to be working with All for One, but then he realized. They had never found All for One's body, so they couldn't be sure he was actually dead. And young Midoriya could have either been acting, or he might not even realize that he was working for an evil supervillain. It was the only conclusion he could come up with. Luckily, young Midoriya had passed the entrance exam, so Toshinori could keep an eye on him to make sure nothing bad came out of it. But first, he would have to make a few phone calls. After all, this meant that All for One was alive after all, which could only end in disaster. Izuku arrived at the library the next day and flung the door open. "Nichan, why didn't you tell me All Might was teaching at UA? 'Cause then you would have pestered me about your score until I told you, and I wanted to keep it a surprise." It was the night before his first day of UA, and Izuku was beyond nervous. He knew that Fumikage and Ida would be in the same class as him, as they had confirmed it over text, so he knew he wouldn't be alone at the school. He also had made sure Dark Shadow wouldn't tell everyone about Nichan without realizing what they were doing, so he didn't have to worry about that secret getting out. He knew Bakugo wasn't allowed into UA, so he didn't have to worry about being blown to bits by him. He knew that no one would bully him for being quirkless, since he was able to copy quirks. That was another thing he didn't have to worry about. But even so, he was dreading that morning. This was UA, his dream school. He shouldn't be so anxious, he should be excited. He would be learning to be a hero, like he'd always wanted. But UA wasn't his dream school because he wanted to go there. It was his dream school because he wanted to be a hero, and graduating UA would be the best way to do that. At the end of the day, it was still a school. The only good school experience he'd had was online schooling, and this was not online school. He knew how schools were. Schools were places where you sat there, hours on end worrying about every little thing you did, making sure you didn't set anyone off. School was where teachers pretended to care when they didn't, and gave you unfair punishment for something that wasn't your fault when they don't like you. School was where your classmates ruined your homework so you got bad grades, and stole your lunch to add to your suffering. School was full of people who wanted to judge you and bully you and, Hey, Nichan whispered, cupping his face in her hands as tears fell down his face. He was trembling, he realized. He must have been caught up in his thoughts. "It'll be okay, Mimi. I'm sure UA isn't like Aldra, otherwise they wouldn't have banned Bakugo. And even if it is like Aldra, I won't let them hurt you, okay?" She pulled him closer to her, in a warm, comforting hug that admittedly helped ease away some of his nerves. "Beep, Nichan, what about the S secret?" Nichan didn't even hesitate before she said, "Mimi, I'm more than willing to risk it if it means you're happy." Izuku stayed in her embrace for a little while longer, until his phone buzzed in his pocket. He didn't bother with it, but it kept buzzing, so eventually he pulled away to check it. "Oh, Mom's worried about me. I guess it got later than I thought, huh?" Izuku mumbled, wiping at the leftover tears on his face. Nichan chuckled. "Yeah, you probably should get home soon. You feeling better now?" "Yeah," Izuku nodded. "Thank you, Nichan." Standing in front of Yua, Izuku felt just as nervous as he did the night before, maybe even more so. He didn't cry, not this time, but he was shaking like a leaf in a windstorm, frozen in the middle of the sidewalk as he stared at the building. He felt a bit silly, to be just standing there shaking while everyone else rushed to find their classes, but he just couldn't get his feet to move. He probably looked pretty pathetic too. This was probably what everyone would end up bullying him over, huh? He was late to class because he just stood there uselessly instead of actually going. He felt a hand on his shoulder, and he hesitantly turned his head to see Fumikage, giving him the closest thing to a smile that his beak could manage. "Do not fret at the darkness ahead of us, for we will be there with you through it all." Dark Shadow nodded enthusiastically, giving him a thumbs up. "Yeah. Don't worry about it, Zook. It'll be fun." While he didn't exactly believe the fun part, he smiled at the two of them. "Thanks, you guys. Let's get to class now, we don't want to be late." They didn't bother waiting for Ida to get there, knowing fully well that he was already in the classroom. The inside of the school was as big as it looked from the outside, if not more. They probably would have gotten lost, if Ida hadn't already sent them directions to get to the right classroom. Soon enough, they were standing in front of a giant door, labeled 1A. "Why is it so big?" asked Dark Shadow, and Izuku shrugged. "For gigantification quirks? Probably." Fumikage opened the door, and the first thing they saw was Ida attempting to wake a purple-haired boy who seemed to have fallen asleep in the seat in front of his. Except, the boy wasn't asleep. It was a trick that Izuku easily recognized. not because it had been done to him but because he used to do it. He'd pretend to be asleep until class started, in hopes it'd make his bullies leave him alone for a while. It worked most of the time, unless they were feeling extra cruel. Purple Boy was pretending to be asleep so that the students would leave him alone. Ida didn't seem to realize that he was pretending, though, so Izuku stepped forward hesitantly. Calm down, Ida-san. He probably needs the rest. I mean, I know I could probably go for a nap about now too, with how nervous I was last night. And it was true enough. With how nervous he was, he'd spent most of the night trying to get comfortable rather than actually sleeping. Ida looked like he wanted to protest, but he thought about it for a moment before nodding. I suppose so. I trust that you'll wake him up if he's still asleep when the bell rings. Izuku nodded, despite knowing that it'd be unnecessary. Slowly but surely, the room started to fill up, and his classmates started conversation with one another, starting to get to know each other. At some point, Izuku noticed a giant, bright yellow caterpillar in the door, which he promptly decided to ignore. He didn't want to know what was up with that. Thank you very much. By the time the bell rang, all the seats had been filled, but the teacher was nowhere to be seen. Purple Boy acted like he had just woken up, and looked genuinely surprised that the teacher wasn't there yet. No one else seemed to notice, too absorbed in their conversations. If you're here to make friends, you can leave now. Came a voice, and it took a second for Izuku to realize that it came from the caterpillar. What the hell? It took you all 8 seconds to calm down. Rational students would do better than that. The caterpillar said, and oh god, the caterpillar was their teacher. But then the caterpillar unzipped itself, and Izuku realized that it wasn't a caterpillar, just a man in a sleeping bag. The man stood up as he said, I'm Aizawa Shoyuda, your homeroom teacher. Purple Boy then whispered, oh my god, Eraserhead is my homeroom teacher, maybe there is hope for me, though no one said anything about it, so he figured he was the only one who heard it. Izuku took another look at the man, and realized that, yes, that is Eraserhead standing in front of him. It might have been exciting for Purple Boy, but it was absolutely terrifying for Izuku. Eraserhead could erase quirks. Izuku was a half-quirk without a host. He had no idea what would happen if Eraserhead used his quirk on him, nor was he eager to find out. Hopefully, he'd be able to avoid it happening, though he figured he should talk to Nachan about it later. Eraserhead pulled a stack of gym uniforms out of seemingly nowhere, and set them down on the podium. Put these on, and meet me outside in 10 minutes. Don't be late or I'll expel you. Well, Izuku thought, at least he's honest about not caring. It was a quirk apprehension test. Izuku was not excited, but he was glad that he had developed his copying ability months ago. Otherwise, he would have failed for sure. Now he had a chance, as long as he chose the right quirks. Most everyone else seemed excited, though, which Eraserhead didn't like, as his hair started to float up. Recognizing it as a tell of Eraserhead's quirk, he ducked behind the nearest person who would make a good shield, a tall boy with many arms. Any quirks activated that weren't mutation quirks vanished under erasure, and Izuku was relieved that his shield had successfully protected him from erasure. You all think this is fun? Fine then. Whoever gets last place will be deemed as not having any potential and will be expelled. Purple Boy froze in fear. Either he had a quirk that wasn't physical, or he didn't have a quirk at all. Either way, though, the way he froze up made Izuku want to run out of his hiding spot to go comfort him, except for the fact that doing so could cause him to fade like he had 200 years ago. But Aizawa-sensei, that's not fair, protested a girl with brown hair. The same girl Izuku had saved from the zero-pointer, he realized. Not fair. He heard Eraserhead say, what about villain attacks? Natural disasters? Petty crimes? Life isn't fair. It's a hero's job to remove that unfairness. So then why are you adding more unfairness? Izuku thought, though he said nothing. He didn't want to be killed at his teacher's quirk because of something like this. But he also wanted to help Purple Boy, because Purple Boy seemed so much like him and he didn't want anyone to feel that sort of way. Except he couldn't help, not without risking his life or whatever would happen when erasure was used on him. Now then, let's start the demonstration. Eraserhead said, Midoriya, you placed first on the entrance exam. Come up here and tell us your highest softball throw score. Oh no. This is where I die, isn't it? Can't even say goodbye to Mom, or Nachan, or Chesa. Right in front of everybody too. I knew this wouldn't be good. Despite his thoughts, he stepped out from his shield, only to find that Eraserhead's quirk was turned off. Right? It turns off once he blinks. He stepped forward and said, FF14P.FF50FF4, 14.54, meters, SS sir. Internally he winced at the stuttering. It made sense, though, this man was a teacher with the ability to make him disappear in a second, and possibly even kill him. A horrible combination that could only end poorly for Izuku. Eraserhead raised an eyebrow at his obvious nerves, but didn't say anything, instead tossing Izuku a softball. Throw it with your quirk. Do whatever you want, just stay inside the circle. What was a good quirk to use for this sort of thing? Maybe Snipe's quirk? Except that was used for aiming, not throwing. Probably an emitter that would produce enough force to propel the ball farther, then. Bakuga's quirk could probably do that, but he wasn't sure he wanted to copy that one. Endeavor's quirk would work similarly, though, and it wasn't as likely to scare him more than he already was, so Hellfire it was. He threw the ball, shooting out a heap of fire along with it, propelling the ball higher than he could have thrown on his own. 753 meters, Izawa stated, holding out a device that displayed the same number. And so, the test had begun. Surprisingly enough, Izuku had gotten first. He supposed between being able to use any hero's quirk and knowing which quirk was best for which job, he got a high score on all of the tests, landing him in first place. In last place was the name Shinso Hitoshi, and based on the distress evident from Purple Boy, that was him. Oh, also, the expulsion was a logical ruse meant to make you do your best. Eraserhead said, and Purple Boy, Shinso, looked like he was going to pass out. After that, they went back to class, and Izuku desperately hoped that had been the most stressful situation of the day. Izuku hadn't been able to pay much attention in class, with how stressed the test had made him. Luckily, it was only introductory classes, so he wasn't too worried, but that didn't mean he didn't notice the worried glances he got because of his dazed look. Classes went by without incident, though, and soon enough, it was time for heroics class. He was almost excited, both because he had joined UA for the heroics class, and because it was the last class, meaning he'd be able to go home. Then All Might burst through the door, shouting, "I am here, coming through the door like a hero." The room dissolved into cheering and excited shouting, most of his classmates eager to learn from All Might. A pang of hurt appeared in Izuku's heart, remembering how it had felt to be left on that rooftop with his dreams crushed. But there was a different presence in the room too. He couldn't see her at the moment, but he could tell Nachan was there too. There was just a sort of warmth in the room that reminded him of when she'd hug him. It was comforting, and a soft smile graced his lips at the feeling despite the tension and stress that he'd been feeling most of the day. Once the room calmed slightly, All Might pulled a whiteboard out of seemingly nowhere, which read, "Battle Training" on it. "Today, we are going to be doing battle training. But first, you must get changed into your costumes." He pressed a button on a remote, which, again, came from seemingly nowhere what the foo, and 20 cases slid out of the wall, each one labeled with a number from 1, "Get into your costumes, and meet me at ground beta for instructions." All Might said, and as soon as he was finished, people were scrambling to get their costumes. Some of them, like Izuku, stayed back until the rest of them had calmed down before getting theirs. Izuku's costume was a one-piece full-body suit, with only his head uncovered. It was forest green, with black geometric patterns on the sides of his torso, arms, and legs. He had requested for the costume to be made of nanobots that could adapt to whatever quirk he copied, and based on the note in the case, they had done just that. The nanobots were programmed to constantly be scanning his body for any indication of what quirk he was going to use, and they were AI so they could quickly adapt to new quirks without too much of an issue. It was admittedly skin-tight, but Izuku didn't mind that too much. It made sense that it'd have to be directly on his skin to scan him properly. It wasn't much for protection, and Izuku knew that it was pretty risky, but he needed to have a costume that could adapt to whatever quirk he copied. Otherwise, the costume would either get in the way or get ruined. For the time being, this was the best he could come up with. Once Izuku had finished putting the costume on, He walked out to ground beta with his classmates. He was the last one out, as he had spent a lot of time reading the note with information on the costume, so once he got out, All Might started explaining the exercise, not so subtly reading from a notepad. Apparently, they would be doing a 2v2 indoors fight, with a hero team and a villain's team. The villain team would be guarding a fake bomb, and the hero team was supposed to either detain the bomb or capture the villains. They'd have a 5-minute prep time, and the exercise would go on for 15 minutes. If the hero team didn't detain the bomb or capture the villains before the 15 minutes were up, the villain team won. Izuku was on the hero team with Uraraka, the girl he saved in the entrance exam and the girl who got infinity in the ball throw. They were up against Ida and Shinso, the latter looking very upset at being on the villain team. All 4 of them went out to the field, and the villain team went into the building to prep while Izuku and Uraraka stayed outside. "Okay, we need a plan," Uraraka said, hitting her palm with her fist. "Yeah, right. My quirk lets me copy any quirk I've seen and know about, but I can only copy one at a time. Ida's quirk is the engines in his legs, and he can use them to make himself faster, but they overheat if he uses them too much. I don't know much about, but I'm guessing he either has a mental quirk, or he's quirkless. What about you?" Uraraka nodded. "My quirk is 0 gravity. I can float anything I touch with all 5 fingers, but doing too much makes me sick." "Great." Izuku said, "I think they'll probably have Shinso guard the bomb, while Ida scouts. Either way, we should probably go in through the top. They'll expect for us to go through the door, so they'll put it high up so it takes us longer. Are you able to float yourself?" "I can, but it makes me sick pretty easily." Izuku nodded. "Alright. I can fly you up then if you want. We should get into character. That way, we can understand what goes through the mind of a villain." "I'm not acting like I'm a villain, yo. Oh my god, have you never seen a real-life villain? Only cartoon characters act like that." The 5 minutes of prep time were up. As soon as All Might announced that they could start, red wings burst from Izuku's back, his costume adjusting itself to fit the wings. He wrapped his arms around Uraraka's torso from behind, before taking off into flight, hovering in front of one of the windows on the 5th floor. Uraraka opened up the window, and Izuku watched as she crawled into it, before flying in himself. The 2 of them stuck together as they walked throughout the empty building, searching for the fake bomb. Then, seemingly out of nowhere, Shinso popped out of the ceiling. "What's up, motherfuckers?" Izuku then proceeded to screech, but was cut off when his body went limp. He couldn't move at all, and Uraraka looked at Shinso with a scandalized expression. "What did you just do to him?" "Jump scared him, apparently," Shinso said, before giving a smug grin. "Now, Midoriya, restrain Uraraka for me." Izuku wanted to protest, but his body was already doing it on its own, and Uraraka was surprised enough by it that he had wrapped her in capture tape before she could do anything about it. Then, Shinso wrapped Izuku in capture tape, and All Might called out, "The villain team wins." Since Izuku's group went first and he didn't need to go to Recovery Girl, Izuku would be able to watch the entirety of the battle trials, which gave him the perfect opportunity to analyze his classmates' quirks, which meant more quirks to copy. It was really exciting, and Izuku was glad that he had decided to bring his newest notebook along with him. At the moment, though, the second team was using their 5 minutes of prep time, so he couldn't really analyze their quirks at the moment. However, he kinda sorta really wanted to talk to Shinso about his quirk. He had a guess as to what it was, but confirmation would be helpful and maybe a few other questions about it. And since Shinso wasn't injured either, nobody was in their group, Izuku could easily go over and ask him. The idea of approaching someone was a bit nerve-wracking, especially with a teacher there, but it wasn't really that much. Between the excitement at the idea of learning about a new quirk and the fact that Shinso was similar to how he used to be, it wasn't too hard to muster up the courage to approach him. Shinso was in an otherwise empty corner of the room behind everyone else, and only a meter away from the door. He was facing outwards, carefully watching everyone in the room. Izuku walked up to him, and Shinso's gaze locked onto him in an instant. "Hi. Can I ask you some questions about your quirk? I think I have a good idea of what it is, but I want to check anyways, and I also have a few other questions. No. Shinso cut him off, voice firm. I'm not giving you information on my quirk that you can use to antagonize me. Right? Izuku had figured that Shinso was probably bullied, but not what for. Based on that, it was probably his quirk. That didn't really make sense to him, though, because it was such a cool quirk. Then again, Izuku thought that about most quirks. Oh, that's not what I meant. It's just, well, I'm able to copy quirks that I know about, and your quirk just seems really cool, so I sorta wanted to know more about it so that I can copy it. I don't want to discriminate against you or anything like that. Shinso narrowed his eyes. Go away. I'm not telling you about my quirk. There was a pang of disappointment in his chest, but Izuku nodded and walked away. People didn't like it when he wrote notes on them. He had forgotten. It was weird and creepy, according to everyone in his old classes. Quirkless Izuku and his creepy stalker notes. That was why he usually only wrote notes on heroes. He must have forgotten since switching to online schooling. The other quirks at the library were happy to let him analyze them for the most part, other than those who preferred to stay secretive. Fumikage and Dark Shadow sometimes asked him to show them his analysis on them, and Ito was alright with it too. But they were merely outliers to the rule. Most of the time, he was called a stalker for it, even if they were just basic observations that he didn't have to look too deep into. Maybe he shouldn't analyze his classmates' quirks while watching the fights, after all. The realization instantly turned his excitement into disappointment and a tinge of sadness. He had been looking forward to learning more about their quirks and getting new quirks that he could copy. He probably shouldn't bother watching the fights at all, then. He knew himself, after all. If he watched the fights while he had his notebook at hand, he'd end up analyzing them anyways. And there wasn't really any way for him to get rid of the notebook other than ruining it or losing it for good, which he wasn't doing. He had some good notes in there. So he didn't pay attention to the screens displaying the fights, instead focusing on anything else. Because of this, he noticed the skeptical glosses All Might kept sending him. For what? There was no reason for All Might to be skeptical about him, unless All Might remembered their first meeting and how he had said he was quirkless. But even then, his medical file stated that he was just a late bloomer for currently unknown reasons, and no one had seemed suspicious of it before. Did he do something wrong then? Oh no, did All Might think that he was some creepy stalker villain now? But All Might had seen his notebook number 13, right? He even signed it. But had he read it? It wasn't like the signature was on the first blank page. It was quite a few pages away from the latest entry at the time, actually. Maybe it had been opened to a blank page already, and All Might just signed that page, so he never saw Izuku's notes. Oh Kami, if All Might himself thought that Izuku was some sort of creepy stalker villain, then it must be true, right? Izuku didn't want to be that, though. He wanted to make people feel happy and safe, not. He needed something to focus on. He couldn't have a breakdown, not here in front of everyone in class. Not in front of a teacher. Not in front of All Might. He just needed to focus on something else for now, and then when he got back home he could deal with his messy emotions. What could he focus on though? Well, analysis always made him feel better. Maybe drawing? Yeah, he had paper and a pencil, he could draw. He wasn't very good at it, but he didn't need to be good. He just needed to distract himself. Izuku was the last to get out of class. He was out of it when the bell rang, and by the time he had realized what was happening, everyone had already left, leaving him in an empty classroom, staring blankly at the chalkboard. Flashbacks to his old school had been going through his mind, reminding him of exactly why he didn't like school. Even with how nervous he'd been at the start of the day, it hadn't prepared him for just how bad it truly was, how horrible the first day had been. And it was only the first day. In his experience, the first day was not the hardest. In fact, it was the easiest. After the first day, it only got more and more stressful. People became more and more comfortable in their roles as his tormentor, teachers shaming him more and more. For not growing out of his foolishness already. Kami, he was dead. Quite possibly literally. Well, there wasn't much he could do to change it. As he began putting his things back in his backpack, Nachan turned visible, standing not too far from his chair, maybe a meter at most. What's wrong, Mimi? You seem upset about something. Oh, Izuku looked down at his shoes, trying to think of a response. Nachan wouldn't be mad at him for it, he knew that. Nachan would give him comfort, help him calm down a bit. But she might get upset at his classmates or his teachers, when this was just the way things were and they couldn't change that. He didn't want that to happen. But it was all just so much, between the threat of his homeroom teacher killing him with his quirk, and the whole being in school, and the fact that he couldn't analyze his classmates' quirks, and the way All Might had been looking at him with suspicion and… He didn't realize that he was saying it all out loud, tears leaking from his eyes like a broken faucet. Nachan frowned, opening her arms in a gesture for a hug. Oh, Mimi, Semir. And he did. Collapsing into her arms, tears poured like waterfalls as he hiccuped and sobbed, Nachan rubbing his back and giving him comfort all the while. Eventually he pulled away, knowing that if he didn't leave soon, he'd end up being locked in the school. Why don't we go back to the library and we'll come up with something there? Nachan said, and he just nodded. With the help of the other quirks at the library, and Chiesa, they managed to come up with some solutions. There were some that they couldn't use, kill the sources of the problems. Arson. Drop out of school. Vive la revolution. But there were some that could feasibly work. For example, Izuku could ask Nizu to switch him over to Class 1B, so that he wouldn't have to worry about Eraserhead's quirk. Izuku could simply ask his classmates who was and wasn't comfortable with him analyzing their quirks. That way he wouldn't make anyone feel uncomfortable while still continuing his analysis. There wasn't much that they could come up with to help with All Might at the moment, since Izuku would really rather not talk to him, but it was enough for now. He stood to the sidelines as his siblings shouted at each other, watching as they argued. Their hosts seemed to mirror their movements as if his siblings had possessed them, but he knew that his siblings simply acted the same as their hosts. Tears streamed down his cheeks, the yelling getting louder and accusatory, as if they had simply forgotten about all the good things, as if they had forgotten how to talk things out and compromise. You guys please dash. The yelling drowned his tear-filled voice out, but he couldn't bear to get any louder. If he did, then they'd probably think that he was yelling at them the same as they were yelling at each other, and that would achieve the opposite effect of what he wanted. A wretched sob broke out of his throat, but it didn't even momentarily distract them. He knew how important the subject was to them. It was important to him, too. It was just, Nachan and Nichan both had strong opinions on how they should go about creating equality for people with strange powers, quirks, as his and Nichan's host liked to call them. That in itself wasn't necessarily a bad thing. The problem was, their ideas were polar opposites of each other, and they were both very stubborn. So stubborn, that rather than trying to talk it out and come up with something they both agreed on, they just yelled at each other and pretended that they were getting somewhere. The amount of times they had each told him that they were making progress in convincing the other was one that he didn't want to try to count. But it didn't matter, because when they were yelling at each other they would never listen, only yell right back. The fight ended with Nichan and his host storming off, an echoed shout of "F you" following them. Nichan's host groaned, flopping onto his bed and curling up in a ball under his sheets as Nichan turned to face him, the familiar words tumbling out of her mouth. I think I'm starting to get through to him, you know? Normally he didn't say anything in response, just gave a weak nod that seemed to satisfy them despite how obviously fake it was. But this time, tears still trailing down his face, he said, and not really no. Nichan blinked, looking at him with confusion as she said, what do you mean, no? Oh, this was a bad idea. While he normally wouldn't worry about what he said to Nichan, she was mad right now. He knew how his siblings were when they were mad. But it was too late now. He had already said it, now he had to follow through with it. It's just. Why'll you guys keep fighting over this? But we all know how stubborn you both are. Why you never listen to each other? Will never get anywhere like this. Nichan growled and he stepped back. What? You want me to listen to his plans? You want me to help him take over the world? Is that it? You want to take over the world too? Is that why you're still sharing hosts with him? A sob tore out of his throat, and as soon as it did, he found himself awaking with a start, sitting up in his bed. Another mimic dream? But it didn't make sense. Nichan wasn't like that, she wouldn't say something like that. She knew that back then he needed a host to survive. Izuku never had nightmares like that. It was the same as the dream of his dying moments. He wanted to say it wasn't real, it was just a bad dream. But Izuku knew better, he knew it was real. It still didn't feel right, though. He should talk to Chiesa about it. He'd ask Nichan, but after that dream, he wasn't so sure. Unfortunately for Izuku, he had to go to school before he could go talk to Chiesa, meaning he was stuck with thoughts of doubt, betrayal, fear, hurt, and so many other tangled up emotions up until school was over. And he still needed to go talk to Nizu about switching classes, although part of him didn't want to. While having a teacher who could kill him in a glance was pretty terrifying, so was being in a class with absolutely no one who he knew. At the very least, he had 3 friends in Class 1A, but he didn't know anyone from Class 1B, which was oh so terrifying. Plus, he didn't quite know what he should say to Nizu when he asked to switch classes. Based on how Aizawa was, if he said that the pressure was a bit too much for him, he'd likely get kicked out of the hero course completely, and it's not like he could just tell the truth of his situation. Would Nizu even believe him if he were to tell the truth? Probably not. Though, he could say that he needed his quirk to stay alive, and he needed to switch classes so he wouldn't get killed by Aizawa's quirk. No matter how uncaring the principal was, no one wanted to be responsible for a death, and it was true, to an extent. Aizawa's quirk would kill him, which was why he needed to change classes. Yeah, that would work. It would be fine, surely Nizu wouldn't say no to something like that. I don't see any reason to switch you out of Aizawa's class, Midoriya-kun. Nizu stated, the smile on his face growing more threatening by the second. Sure, you say that you need your quirk to survive, but I don't see how that's the case. After all, if you needed the quirk to survive, you would have gotten it sooner, or it would have come in a stressful event rather than causing stress. Plus, it's a simple copy quirk, there's no reason why you depend on it to survive. Even if you did need it to survive, there's no way you would know that. Really, what you're trying to do is obvious to me. Either you're discriminating against Aizawa-kun's quirk, or you think that if you switch classes, there'll be less pressure. I would suggest you get rid of whichever mindset it is, if you want to stay here in UA. Between those words, that smile, and all the negative emotions from his dream memory before, Izuku had a hard time keeping himself from breaking down into tears. But, Principal Nizu dash. No buts. Nizu cut him off. If I hear any more of this matter, you're out of UA. Do you understand? No, was what Izuku wanted to say. No, I don't understand why you want to keep me in Aizawa's class. I told you his quirk could kill me, but he couldn't say that, or he'd be kicked out of UA, and if he was kicked out of UA, what were the chances that another hero school would take him on? Very low, that's what. And if he couldn't go to a hero school, he couldn't be a hero, and he had to be a hero. Wait, I understand, Izuku whispered, voice cracking. Nizu clapped his paws together. Good, good. Now off to class with you. Fumikage and Dark Shadow had a similar conversation with Aizawa, apparently. They had tried to tell him that when he used his quirk, Dark Shadow was temporarily trapped in a completely empty place and how scary it was for them, thus asking Aizawa not to use his quirk on Fumikage, but Aizawa instead used his quirk purely for intimidation purposes and made the same accusations Nizu had. Izuku listened to the two of them talking about it, while hastily eating his own lunch. Normally, Ida began when they finished, I would say that we should respect our superior's decisions, but in this case, it seems rather unfair. Especially since you were being so respectful about it, but he still threatened to punish you. Izuku shrugged, hiding his own swirling emotions behind a mask of calm. Teachers are never really fair. Still, that must really SCK, huh? Dark Shadow nodded, shivering. Yeah, that place is terrifying. It's like going into a coma or something. How about you? Has his quirk done anything bad to you? Does this happen to all sentient quirks, or just me? Izuku shrugged. Not sure, I wasn't in his line of sight when he used it. They nodded and Ida piped up. Luckily, his quirk only makes it impossible for my engines to start up. I wouldn't want to know what happens if it got rid of my engines as well. Well, that's good at least, Dark Shadow replied, and Tokoyami nodded. It'd be a shame if our companions were to be harmed by the same darkness that harms us, he said, sipping on his orange juice. The rest of the day wasn't nearly as stressful as the day before, with all might going through a lecture on safety in indoor fights, clearly put together by someone else. Unfortunately, the lack of stress meant there was nothing to distract him from his racing thoughts, and the fact that he knew Nichan was there didn't help. Normally, just knowing the Nichan was there could be comforting, but considering that she was the reason he was so freaked out in the first place. Izuku didn't get it. He knew what had happened in that dream, knew that chances were, it was real. But he also knew Nichan, didn't he? He knew that she wouldn't do something like that, right? Nichan was nice and supportive and friendly, and she cared about him, and she wouldn't say something like that, right? After all, she knew that he needed a host to survive back then. She was the same way. So why would she ever say something like that? But Izuku also knew how he died. He went too long without a host to support him, and so he died. But before that, he shared hosts with his older brother. At some point, something had made him want to separate from his host, and that dream seemed like just the thing to make that happen. The dream had cut off in what seemed like the middle of the memory, though, so maybe they had made up after it or something. Maybe he was making it out to be more than it was. Maybe it was already done and over with and he just didn't know because he didn't have all his memories from his past life. It would make sense, with all the happy memories he knew he had from after they had made the library and moved in there. But what if that wasn't the case, and they never really had made up? What if that was why he had been running away from the library in his final moments? He didn't know. He couldn't know until he talked to Chiesa about it. Which, the more he thought about it, the more nerve-wracking the thought got. What if she didn't know anything either? But it wasn't like he had another plan. Soon enough, class was over, and he was on his way to the Quirky Books library. Nichan wasn't at the library yet. That was good for Izuku, as it meant that he could talk to Chiesa without something bad happening. He hesitantly approached the desk Chiesa stood behind, and she looked up at him, smiling. "Oh, hello, Izuku." He waved in response. "Hey, Ayaka-chan. I have something I need to talk to you about," he said, fidgeting with the hems of his shirt. She hummed. "What is it? Did something bad happen at school?" He shook his head. "Not exactly. Can we go to my old room to talk about it? It's not something I want to talk about in front of the others." Chiasa's expression quickly turned far more serious as she nodded, walking out from behind the desk. The two of them approached the bookshelf in the back, and Izuku pushed down on the lever, opening the secret passage that would lead to his old room. Izuku sat down on the green bed, the sheets still the same as the last time he'd been in the room when he first found it. Chiesa sat down next to him. "So, what's going on?" He sighed, staring at his hands folded carefully in his lap. "You know how I sometimes get memories from my past as dreams?" Chiesa nodded, giving a sound of affirmation, so he continued on. "Last night, I had one. It was a bad memory. Really bad. You know how Nichan and my older brother fought a lot before we met you?" She nodded once again, and this time Izuku hesitated before saying anything. He could tell that Chiesa was starting to piece it together, but this memory wasn't just a family fight, and chances were, she wouldn't know which he was referring to. He had to tell her, but the words were caught in his throat for a moment. She waited patiently for him to finish, and eventually he sighed. "She yelled at me. It was after another fight, and she was telling me that she thought she was starting to get through to him. I told her that she wasn't because they never actually listened to what the other was saying, so she yelled at me. She said that I was just siding with him, and that's why I was sharing hosts with him." Chiesa stared at him in shock, blinking slowly. I knew your family fights were bad, but, well, that's something else." Izuku nodded. "Yeah. I didn't really know what to do after I got that dream, so I was hoping you'd be able to help." She hummed. "Well, I didn't actually know about this incident until now. You two were pretty secretive, after all. If you'd like, I could help you talk to Bulb about it?" Yeah, I guess." He'd never admit to it, but Bakugo was more than a bit nervous as he walked to the principal's office. Bakugo never got called to the principal's office, except to be congratulated for his awesomeness, and considering it was only the second day, it was a bit too early for that to be the case. And considering that he was banned from UA, it was understandable that he was nervous. Of course, That nervousness only fueled his near-constant anger. He didn't bother knocking before he opened the door, greeted by the sight of Principal Maki sitting behind her desk, an unreadable expression on her face. Though, Bakugo never really cared to read others' expressions. Why should it matter to him, anyways? They were all extras, so their input wasn't important. Bakugo-san, I'm glad you came. Principal Maki said, gesturing to the seat across from hers. Why don't you sit down? There's something important I need to talk to you about. Bakugo grumbled in response, but sat down anyways. What the hell do you want? She hummed. Well, I wanted to talk to you about your enrollment in this school. You know, normally, we don't allow bullies in Shiketsu. Bakugo smirked. But I'm so strong that it doesn't matter, right? Principal Maki pursed her lips, shaking her head. No. In fact, because you use your strength to hurt people, that just makes it worse. But I looked into the school a bit, and I decided that there might be a chance for you to get better. So I let you apply. But I do have some conditions for if you want to stay here. Bakugo opened his mouth to protest, but she didn't let him say anything. You'll have to take mandatory anger management classes, and if you haven't shown that you're willing to try to change by the end of the semester, you're out. That doesn't mean you have to be completely changed by that time, you just have to show that you're willing to try. Got it? He wanted to say no, but he got a gut feeling that it was the quickest way to get himself kicked out, and he wouldn't be able to transfer to a new school now. So, he found himself nodding begrudgingly. Even though Chesa would be helping him, he was so FNG scared. What would he do if Nichan yelled at him like she had in the dream? Sure, he had experience with people who he cared about leaving him, but that didn't make it any better. If anything, it would just be worse because that would just mean that he was just that unlovable, right? Chesa led him back out to the library, where Nichan now sat at one of the tables. She must have just been taking a bit longer to get there. She smiled when she saw the two of them. There you two are. I was wondering why you weren't here. Nichan, we need to talk. We need to talk. Izuku said, head hanging down. As soon as the words were off his tongue, a wave of guilt, doubt, and fear crashed into him full force. All his previous doubts came back in tenfold, and it was a wonder that he didn't break down sobbing at some of the thoughts that crossed his mind. Nichan stood up in an instant, running over to him. Mimi? Are you okay? Did something happen? Izuku hummed, trying to decide how to respond before settling on, you know how I've been having dreams of my past? I had one of those last night. Nichan slowly nodded, encouraging him to continue. It wasn't a good memory. You know our family fights? Nichan nodded, taking a single step closer as she said, Oh, Mimi, I know that those fights always made you upset, but all for one dash. He shook his head frantically. It wasn't him. Nichan froze for a moment, surprised. Her face flashed between emotions, shock, confusion, worry, until it settled on one, regret. She said nothing. Instead, she watched as he took a stumbled step back, surprised by his outburst. He hadn't meant to be that loud. He should be able to control himself better than that. He didn't want to make her upset or angry, after all. But it was too late now, it had already happened. He couldn't rewind time. He didn't know any quirks that could do that for him to copy, but he really wished he did. Deep breaths. Focus. He could do this. No one spoke, but Chesa was giving him a look, one that said she was willing to talk for him, at least until he had calmed down a bit. He wanted to say no, that he could handle it. He didn't want to make this hard for her, after all. The two of them were so much closer to each other than he was to either of them, even if they were the people he was closest to. They had known each other for so much longer, and this probably hurt Chesa far more than it would him. But he was scared. He was scared, so he's scared of messing up worse than he already had. He just wanted to figure out,